In the quiet fields of Minnesota, a farmer once dug into the earth and pulled out a stone that should not exist, covered in mysterious runes. It tells a story of explorers crossing the ocean centuries before Columbus. Some say it proves Vikings reached America. Others whisper of the Knights Templar, hiding their secrets in plain sight. But is it a message from the past, or the greatest hoax in American history? Tonight, we unravel the lost history of the Kensington Runestone. Beneath the soil of a quiet Minnesota farm lies a mystery that has unsettled historians for more than a century. In 1898, a man named Olaf Oman was clearing land near Kensington when his shovel struck something solid. What he uncovered was not a simple rock, but a stone unlike any other, a rectangular slab, weighing over 100 pounds, its surface carved with strange symbols. At first glance, it looked almost meaningless, but to those familiar with ancient alphabets, the markings were unmistakable runes. The very same runes once etched by Viking explorers, medieval Scandinavians, and perhaps, some say, the guardians of Europe's most forbidden secrets. Imagine holding that stone in your hands, a farmer in the middle of America, far from the fjords of Norway or the battlefields of the Crusades, staring at letters from another world. What was this object doing here, thousands of miles and hundreds of years away from where it belonged? To skeptics, it was a hoax, nothing more than a prank carved by immigrants to amuse themselves. But to others, the Kensington Runestone was a message left by voyagers who crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus, a whisper from a chapter of history that official textbooks refused to recognize. For over a century, the stone has divided scholars, archaeologists, and adventurers. Was it the work of Vikings, whose sagas tell of Vinland and journeys to a distant western land? Could it be tied to the Knights Templar, fleeing persecution in Europe, carrying with them not only their treasures but their secret codes? Or was it, as critics argue, nothing more than a farmer's clever fabrication, a fraud that spiraled out of control? Each theory carries its own evidence, its own fervent believers, and its own mysteries. But what makes the Runestone so haunting is not just the question of who carved it, it is what the inscription claims. The runes, once translated, tell of a tragic expedition, a band of explorers, 30 in all, who journeyed far from the safety of their ship only to meet a violent fate. The words carved into the stone read like a gravestone, a memorial left behind in grief, a final attempt to tell the world what happened here. If genuine, it means that centuries before the Pilgrims, before Jamestown, before Columbus even set sail, travelers from across the ocean had stood on American soil and left their mark. Tonight, we unravel that mystery. We will trace the history of the stone, examine the strange markings that connect it to secret traditions, and follow the trail of evidence that stretches from a Minnesota field to the shadowed chambers of the medieval Knights Templar. Along the way, we will confront the skeptics, explore the legends, and ask the question that has haunted this stone since the moment it was unearthed. Is the Kensington Runestone the greatest archaeological discovery in American history, or the greatest deception? And so, our journey begins. A journey not just into the soil of Minnesota, but into the buried layers of time, where history and legend blur, and where a single stone might hold the key to rewriting everything we think we know about the past. The morning Olaf Oman struck the stone seemed ordinary enough, a farmer's day like countless others. He had lived in Minnesota for years, clearing forests to make space for fields, carving a living out of the stubborn soil. His hands, calloused and scarred, were used to the rhythm of axe and spade. But that morning in 1898, as his shovel bit into the earth, it hit something with an unexpected hardness. Not the roots or rocks he was accustomed to, but something squared, deliberate, shaped by human hands. At first, it looked like just another obstacle, another rock to haul out of the way. But when the dirt was brushed aside and the surface revealed, Omen's eyes met strange markings cut deep into the stone. Angular symbols, precise, deliberate lines that carried intent. Runes. It is easy to imagine the shock of that moment. For Olaf, a Swedish immigrant, these markings would not have been entirely alien. He had grown up with stories of the Vikings, of runestones that dotted the Scandinavian countryside, memorials left by long-dead warriors. The shapes on the stone, unearthed in Minnesota, mirrored those same ancient forms, carrying echoes of his homeland across an ocean and centuries of time. His first reaction may have been disbelief. How could such a thing end up here, in the wilderness of America's Midwest, where there was no record, no memory, of such people ever having walked? Word spread quickly. What had begun as a farmer's accidental discovery soon drew neighbors, scholars, and skeptics alike. The stone was heavy, nearly 200 pounds, its face inscribed with runic characters covering its surface. People crowded around it, debating its meaning. Was this an authentic relic of explorers long forgotten, or a clever forgery? Translators worked on the text, and soon a chilling message emerged. The stone seemed to tell a story of tragedy. 8 Gatlanders and 22 Norwegians on a journey of exploration from Vinland westward. We had a camp by Discary's 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were fishing one day. When we came home, found 10 men red with blood and dead. Ave Maria, save from evil. The words, simple and direct, struck like a thunderclap. They spoke of loss, of men far from home, ambushed and killed. They spoke of an expedition in which 30 men had traveled deep inland, away from their ships, carving this inscription as a record of their fate. If true, it meant that Scandinavians had not only reached America, but had explored far into its interior, centuries before Columbus, leaving behind a desperate memorial of their presence. The news did not take long to spark both fascination and outrage. To believers, this was the missing piece of a puzzle. The Norse Sagas had long told of Vinland, a mysterious land west across the ocean, rich in grapes and resources, where Viking explorers had sailed under Leif Erikson. Archaeological evidence of their presence at Land's Ox Meadows in Newfoundland had already begun to surface. Why not further inland? Why not Minnesota? Perhaps this stone was confirmation that those sagas were true, that their journeys had extended far beyond what conventional history allowed. But skeptics were quick to respond. To them, the story seemed too convenient, too extraordinary. Was it possible that a Scandinavian immigrant, like Omen, had carved the stone himself, using his knowledge of runes to create a convincing relic? Was it nothing more than a hoax designed to stir attention, or perhaps even just a misunderstanding of markings that were never meant to be historical at all? The academic world recoiled. Many dismissed it outright, labeling it a forgery, an amateur attempt at rewriting history. Yet the stone remained, heavy, silent, and undeniable. It could not be wished away. For every scholar who scoffed, there was another who leaned closer, tracing the carvings, comparing them to known inscriptions, noting subtle details that were difficult to dismiss. The hooked X, for example, a curious variation of the rune for the letter, appeared on the Kensington Runestone. This same symbol had been found in other contexts, linked to the medieval Knights Templar and later to secret traditions carried on by Freemasons. Could such a detail have been invented by a simple farmer, or did it hint at a deeper truth, a connection across centuries and oceans? As debate raged, the stone began its second life not just as an artifact, but as a mirror reflecting the hopes, doubts, and dreams of those who studied it. To some, it was proof that history was far richer and more complex than the textbooks admitted. To others, It was a reminder of humanity's eagerness to believe in mysteries, to project meaning where there may be none. And yet, despite every attempt to explain it away, the stone itself endured, its runes still sharp, still legible, still whispering the same haunting tale. Imagine, for a moment, the scene described by those runes, a group of explorers far from home, trekking through dense forests and along winding rivers. They carried with them not only their weapons and supplies, but their traditions, their language, their faith. They camped near the water, perhaps hopeful, perhaps weary, carving out a fragile existence in a new and unfamiliar world. And then, disaster, returning to camp to find their companions slaughtered, their blood staining the earth. The grief of that moment must have been overwhelming, yet they did not flee immediately. Instead, they took the time to carve a memorial, inscribing their sorrow into stone, leaving behind a record not only of death but of their own presence, hoping someone, someday, would understand. The more one dwells on this possibility, the harder it is to dismiss. A hoax could explain the stone's presence, but could it capture that raw humanity? Could it capture the desperation of men in a foreign land, far from the comforts of home? Caught between survival and oblivion, the Runestone's message carries an emotional weight that transcends simple invention. Whether authentic or not, it speaks to something deeper, the universal desire to be remembered, to leave behind a trace, to not vanish into silence. Over the years, countless theories have been proposed. Some argue the stone was left by Norse explorers connected to Leif Erikson's expeditions, who ventured further inland than previously believed. Others suggest it might have ties to the Knights Templar, fleeing persecution in Europe, carrying with them not only treasures but sacred knowledge, carving secret symbols into the stone as a way to mark their journey. A smaller camp insists it is nothing more than a modern hoax, carved by Omen himself or someone in his circle. Each perspective has its evidence, its logic, its fervent defenders. And so, the Kensington Runestone remains perched between legend and fact, neither fully embraced nor entirely dismissed. An artifact that refuses to settle into the tidy categories of history. It is a puzzle piece without a clear picture to fit into, a relic that demands not just explanation, but imagination. For those willing to listen, it becomes more than a stone. It becomes a doorway into the unknown, into a version of history where explorers crossed the ocean long before Columbus, where Templars may have hidden their knowledge in the New World, where the boundaries between myth and fact blur. Even now, more than a century after its discovery, the Runestone continues to provoke debate. Museums display it, books are written about it, documentaries film it, and still, no consensus emerges. It is as if the stone was designed to resist conclusion, to force us to wrestle with uncertainty. That may, in fact, be its greatest legacy, not the certainty of its origin, but the questions it demands we ask. And so, as we begin our journey deeper into the story of the Kensington Runestone, we must hold the truths in our minds. First, that it could very well be a hoax, a clever invention that fooled the world. And second, that it might just be genuine, a message from the past carried across oceans, carved into stone and buried in American soil. Between those two truths lies the tension that keeps this mystery alive, that fuels the fascination and controversy that have lasted more than a century. But beyond authenticity, beyond debate, there is a deeper question. Why does this stone matter so much? Why does the possibility of pre-Columbian contact stir such passion, such resistance? Perhaps it is because it challenges the neat narrative of discovery, the story that begins with Columbus and unfolds predictably from there. Perhaps it is because it hints that the world has always been more connected, more complex than we are taught to believe. Or perhaps it is because, deep down, We want to believe that history still holds secrets waiting to be uncovered, that the past is not a closed book, but a living mystery. The Kensington Runestone, heavy and silent, continues to demand our attention. It sits at the crossroads of history and legend, a relic that forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge and the power of our imagination. Whether carved by explorers in the 14th century or by a farmer in the 19th, it has succeeded in its purpose. It has made us wonder, it has made us question, and it has made us remember. And that is where our story truly begins. The storm began almost immediately, the moment the Kensington Runestone was translated. It no longer belonged to Olaf Oman or the quiet farm in Minnesota. It belonged to the wider world. And with that came scrutiny, doubt, and, soon enough, ridicule. Scholars descended on the stone with sharpened pens and sharper opinions for some. It was laughable a farmer's prank, poorly executed, and far too clumsy to fool anyone with genuine expertise. For others, it was a dangerous object, because if it were accepted as real, it would mean rewriting a chapter of American history. And rewriting history is never done lightly. From the start, much of the academic reaction was not neutral, not cautious, but hostile. One might have expected scholars to approach such a discovery with curiosity, even excitement. After all, if the Runestone were authentic, it would be one of the most important archaeological finds in American history. But instead, many rushed to dismiss it outright. They pointed to the language of the inscription, which some claimed included words and grammar too modern to have existed in the 14th century. They highlighted supposed inconsistencies in the runes, themselves claiming they were hybrids, mismatched, anachronistic. The verdict for the academic establishment seemed clear: forgery. But history has a way of punishing certainty. Over the decades, as research deepened, some of those early criticisms began to unravel. Linguistic details once thought impossible for the 14th century were later found in obscure dialects of medieval Swedish. Rune forms dismissed as modern inventions turned out to have precedence in Scandinavian inscriptions little known at the time of Oman's discovery. The more scholars looked, the less simple the dismissal became. And yet the stain of ridicule lingered. Oman himself bore much of it. The poor immigrant farmer was accused of staging the whole affair, carving the stone in his spare time to trick the learned men of the East Coast. His motives, critics claimed, were obvious: attention, notoriety, perhaps even money. But those who knew Oman personally found the accusation absurd. He was no scholar. He had little time for elaborate hoaxes. He had been, in fact, deeply shaken by the discovery, and would later say he wished he had never found the stone at all, given the trouble it brought to his life. If it had been a prank, it was one that tormented him more than it rewarded. The deeper reason for the hostility, perhaps, lay not in the stone itself, but in what it represented. To accept the Kensington Runestone as genuine would mean acknowledging that European Scandinavians, perhaps even Templars, had traveled far into the North American interior long before Columbus. It would mean appending a narrative carefully, built not just in textbooks, but in national identity. Columbus, the bold discoverer, was the cornerstone of that story. To dethrone him with a weathered, rune-covered stone from Minnesota was unthinkable. It was not only American pride at stake. For academics, the stone represented professional risk. To support it openly was to invite ridicule, to be lumped in with cranks and romantics. Careers could be derailed by a single wrong association. And so, the Runestone became a kind of forbidden object in the scholarly world. Too dangerous to touch, too risky to defend. Silence, in many cases, was safer than curiosity. Yet not all were silent. A small band of defenders emerged over the years: scholars, amateur researchers, and even linguists who dared to argue that the stone might be genuine. They combed through medieval Scandinavian texts, searching for linguistic parallels. They compared rune forms, finding unexpected matches in carvings from Sweden and Norway. They tested the stone itself, analyzing the weathering of the grooves, arguing that the carving showed signs of centuries of age rather than recent work. Each new piece of evidence seemed to complicate the easy dismissal. Nudging the stone closer to legitimacy, the debates became fierce, sometimes bitter. For every article declaring the Runestone a hoax, another appeared suggesting it could be authentic. For every academic who dismissed it as nonsense, another raised uncomfortable questions. It was not simply a matter of evidence anymore. It had become a battle of reputations, of worldviews, of who had the right to shape the story, of America's past. And then there was the matter of the hooked X among the carved letters on the Runestone. A peculiar variation of the rune for A appeared multiple times. Instead of the standard cross shape, the lines split, creating a distinctive, hooked form. At first, this seemed unremarkable, perhaps even a slip of the carver's hand. But as researchers studied it more closely, they found the same symbol appearing in other contexts that connected the stone to far more than Scandinavian explorers. The hooked X had appeared in manuscripts and carvings associated with the Knights Templar, the secretive medieval order dissolved in the early 14th century. It appeared again in the traditions of Freemasonry, whose symbols carried echoes of Templar knowledge. The recurrence of this unusual symbol suggested something more than coincidence. Could it be that the Runestone was not merely Scandinavian, but linked to a hidden current of European history, a brotherhood that may have crossed the Atlantic long before Columbus? For skeptics, this was a leap too far, but for believers, it was electrifying. If the Templars had indeed fled persecution in Europe, carrying with them their treasures and secrets, where better to hide than in a vast, uncharted land across the ocean? The Runestone, then, was not just a record of tragedy, but a clue to a larger story, a story of exodus, survival, and hidden knowledge. The idea may seem outlandish, but consider the climate of the 14th century. The Templars had been crushed in Europe, their leaders burned, their order dissolved. Yet whispers of their survival persisted. Their ships, it was said, vanished into the Atlantic. Their treasures disappeared. Their knowledge, encoded in symbols and architecture, remained scattered across Europe. If they had crossed the ocean, leaving behind traces like the Kensington Runestone, it would explain both the presence of the hooked X and the desperate tone of the inscription. Of course, such theories stretched far beyond what traditional scholars were willing to entertain. To them, the Runestone was already problematic. To tie it to the Templars was to wander into the realm of conspiracy and legend. And yet, legends have a way of clinging to objects like this, as if the stone itself demanded a story grand enough to match its mystery. For Olaf Oman, however, all of this was far from his concern. In the years after the discovery, he faced relentless suspicion. Reporters hounded him, academics mocked him, neighbors whispered. His life, once quiet and steady, became entangled in controversy he had never sought. He denied repeatedly that he had carved the stone, insisting he had no reason to stage such a thing. But the accusations persisted, and with them came a weariness that never left him. By the time of his death, he had been so battered by skepticism that he was said to regret ever having found the stone at all. And yet, in a strange way, that regret only adds to the mystery. If it were a hoax, if Oman had carved it himself, why would he cling to denial until the end? Why would he endure ridicule, suspicion, and hardship for no reward? What motive could justify decades of torment? To this day, no convincing answer has been given. The Runestone sits now in a museum in Minnesota, displayed behind glass, its Runes still sharp, its message still haunting. Visitors come to see it, to stand in front of it, to feel the weight of its mystery. Some walk away convinced it is real. Others shake their heads, certain it is a fake. But few leave indifferent. The stone demands a response. It stirs something deep in the imagination, a yearning for a past richer and stranger than we are told. Perhaps that is why it continues to matter, because in the end, the battle over the Kensington Runestone is not just about runes and translations. It is about who controls the story of history. It is about the courage to question, the willingness to consider the impossible, and the recognition that sometimes the truth is stranger than the tidy tales. Written in our textbooks, the Runestone is, at its core, an invitation to look again at the past, to imagine a world where oceans were crossed before Columbus, where brotherhoods carried secrets across continents, where history is not a straight line but a labyrinth of forgotten paths. Whether genuine or forged, it has already succeeded in its purpose. It has made us wonder, and that wonder is where our journey must continue. Night settles over the Minnesota fields differently once you know the story of the stone. The wind in the trees, the hush of the grass, the stillness of the land. Suddenly it feels like more than prairie. It feels like a stage where something ancient played out, a forgotten drama etched into granite. That is the strange spell of the Kensington Runestone. It transforms a quiet farm into a sacred site, a place where history and myth bleed together. From the beginning, people sensed there was something uncanny about the stone. Not only the words carved into its surface, but the placement, the timing, the sense that it had been waiting to be found. Even Olaf Omen's discovery has an air of ritual about it, his axe striking roots tangled around the stone, as though the earth itself had kept the artifact hidden until it was ready to speak. Some researchers would later argue that this was no accident. The Runestone, they suggest, was not just a record of a tragedy, but a marker, a geodetic point in a web of sacred geometry laid out across North America. This idea may sound outlandish at first, but pause for a moment. In Europe, we know medieval builders aligned their cathedrals with astronomical events, encoded geometry into stone, and used numbers as symbols. If the explorers who carved the Runestone carried the same traditions, why would they abandon them on the far side of the Atlantic? The clue lies in the inscription itself. Beyond its haunting story of men lost and killed, the runes contain subtle oddities, the peculiar count of words, the recurrence of numbers, the enigmatic hooked X. To the untrained eye, these might seem like quirks. To those versed in esoteric traditions, they are signals, keys to a hidden layer of meaning. Take the hooked X as we saw. It appears repeatedly on the Runestone, where a simple rune would have sufficed. Why choose that form for defenders of the stone? The answer lies in Templar symbolism. The hooked X has been interpreted as representing not just a letter, but a fusion of ideas, male and female, heaven and earth, visible and invisible. It is, in essence, a symbol of union, of balance, of secret knowledge. Its presence on the Runestone suggests that whoever carved it was not merely recording an event, but embedding a symbol for posterity, a whisper to those who would one day recognize it. Then there is the matter of numbers. The inscription speaks of 10 men left by the sea, 14 days' journey north, to slain. To skeptics, these are details in a tragic story. To esoteric interpreters, numbers are never just numbers. 10 may signify completion, a cycle fulfilled. 14 may echo lunar cycles, a rhythm of time. To slain may carry echoes of sacrifice, the pairing of opposites. If this sounds speculative, remember, the medieval world was steeped in numerology. To carve numbers into stone was to carve meaning. But the geometry does not end on the Runestone's surface. Some researchers argue that when plotted on a map, The location of the Runestone aligns with other enigmatic sites: the Newport Tower in Rhode Island, the Westford Knight carving in Massachusetts, and even Oak Island in Nova Scotia. These sites, scattered across the continent, form lines and triangles that echo sacred geometry used by the Templars and Masons. Coincidence? Perhaps, but once you begin tracing the lines, the pattern emerges with unsettling clarity. It is as though someone marked the land itself, leaving waypoints for those who could read them. Skeptics dismiss such alignments as pattern-seeking, the human tendency to find order where none exists. Yet this dismissal underestimates the medieval mind. To the builders of cathedrals, to the navigators of seas, geometry was not arbitrary. It was sacred. It was the language of God written into creation. If a group of explorers, whether Norse, Templar, or some fusion of the two, traveled to the New World, they would have carried this worldview with them. They would have marked their passage not just with words, but with geometry, carving their story into the very landscape. And here, the Runestone becomes more than an artifact. It becomes a key to a network, a breadcrumb and a trail that spans oceans. The words may tell of tragedy, but the placement, the symbols, the geometry, they tell of purpose. This is why the Runestone continues to attract not only historians, but mystics, masons, and seekers of all kinds. For them, the stone is not merely about who arrived in America first. It is about a lineage of hidden knowledge, carried across generations, encoded in symbols, whispered through stone. The Kensington Runestone is one voice in a chorus that includes Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, the labyrinthine carvings of Chartres Cathedral in France, and the shadowed vaults of Templar strongholds in Portugal. Each site, in its own way, hums with the same frequency: secrecy, geometry, mystery. Even the land itself seems to respond. In the 20th century, researchers noted that the Runestone's location lies near the continental divide, where waters flow either to the Atlantic or the Arctic. This liminal geography, a place between worlds. Between waters, echoes the liminal symbolism of the hooked X. It is as if the carvers chose their site deliberately, embedding their mark at a crossroads of nature itself. What were they trying to say? Some argue it was a claim, a territorial marker declaring, "We were here." Others see it as a memorial, a grave marker for the men lost. Still others believe it was a message to future initiates, a signpost for those carrying on the same hidden tradition centuries later. The truth may be all three at once. Medieval minds were comfortable with layers of meaning. A rune could be a letter, a number, and a symbol, all at once. A stone could be history, geometry, and prophecy, carved together into a single message. For the modern visitor, standing before the Runestone in its museum case, such possibilities can feel overwhelming. The grooves are sharp, the runes still legible despite the centuries. You can trace them with your eyes, knowing that someone long ago pressed chisel to stone with intent. Was it desperation? Ritual? Both. And why here, in this place, so far from the known roots of Norse exploration? These questions linger like the echo of a chant, refusing to leave. It is worth remembering, too, how many other mysteries in North America remain unresolved. The Newport Tower, with its circular arches and European style, stands unexplained. In Rhode Island, the Westford Knight, a faint carving of a medieval swordsman, lies etched into a boulder in Massachusetts. Oak Island's endless pits and symbols continue to defy explanation in Nova Scotia. Each of these, like the Runestone, has been dismissed, debated, defended. Each, like the Runestone, refuses to fade. Together, they form a constellation of enigmas, as though an invisible hand scattered markers across the continent, waiting for us to notice. The Kensington Runestone is the heart of that constellation. It is the most explicit, the most direct, the one that speaks in words rather than riddles, and yet it is also the most contested, because words can be dissected, analyzed, and doubted. A tower may stand and be mysterious. A knight may be faintly etched and remain ambiguous. But a stone that speaks, that carves a message of men and death and oceans crossed, demands belief or rejection. It leaves no neutral ground. And so, the Runestone remains a mirror to skeptics. It reflects gullibility, the eagerness to see, patterns in random scratches. To believers, it reflects courage, the willingness of medieval explorers to cross oceans in search of destiny. To others still, it reflects secrecy, the survival of a brotherhood through storm and persecution, leaving behind signs for those with eyes to see. Whichever reflection you choose, the stone continues to speak. It speaks in numbers, in geometry, in symbols carved into granite and echoed across continents. It whispers of voyages forgotten, of tragedies buried, of truths hidden in plain sight. And perhaps that is the real power of the Kensington Runestone. Not that it proves anything beyond doubt, but that it refuses to be silenced. For more than a century, it has sparked debates, inspired research, fueled imagination. It has stood as both artifact and riddle, inviting us to look again at what we think we know. And the deeper we look, the more it reveals not answers, perhaps, but possibilities. Possibilities that stretch from Minnesota fields to European cathedrals. Possibilities that tie Norse runes to Templar symbols. Possibilities that suggest history is less a straight road and more a labyrinth, winding, hidden, waiting for us to trace its path. And as we step deeper into that labyrinth, the next question looms larger. If the Runestone truly is part of a larger network, then what else lies hidden in the forests, rivers, and stones of America? What other markers, what other voices remain, waiting for discovery? The Runestone was not the end, it was the beginning. The story of America's forgotten past does not end in Minnesota's fields. If the Kensington Runestone is a voice carved into stone, then far to the east in Rhode Island, another sentinel stands silently, weathered by centuries, waiting to be understood. This one is not buried beneath roots or hidden in soil. It rises above the ground, its arches open to sky, its columns supporting a circular crown. It is the Newport Tower, an enigma in stone that has baffled historians for centuries. At first glance, it might look like a ruin from medieval Europe, the kind of round structure you might expect to find attached to a chapel in Scotland, or standing on a windswept hill in Ireland. Yet it is not in Europe. It stands instead in Newport, Rhode Island, a small coastal town that would one day become a wealthy colonial port. But when you stand before the tower, you cannot help but feel a dissonance. It does not belong here. Among colonial houses and modern streets, it belongs to another place, another time. The tower is made of rough stone, its 8 arches rising from thick pillars that support a circular chamber above. It is neither large nor ornate, but it radiates presence. Visitors who first see it often pause, as though sensing something ancient, something not quite explained by the usual narrative. Was it simply a colonial windmill, as some insist? Or does it whisper of a story that reaches across the Atlantic, across centuries, across the very boundaries of accepted history? The orthodox explanation is straightforward. The Newport Tower was built in the mid-1600s by Governor Benedict Arnold, great-grandfather of the infamous traitor of the American Revolution. According to this account, it was modeled after windmills Arnold had seen in England. Simple, practical, and functional. But even in Arnold's own will, he refers to it as his stone-built windmill, a phrase that suggests he may not have thought of it as unique or mysterious at all. For skeptics, that is the end of the matter. And yet, there are problems. Windmills of that era, Even those built in stone typically do not look like this. They lack the peculiar arches, the uneven stonework, the astronomical alignments that researchers would later discover in the Newport Tower. And if it were truly a mere windmill, why has it drawn so much speculation for centuries? Why does it look so much more like the medieval round churches of the Knights Templar in Europe? That is the crux of the mystery. To the careful observer, the Newport Tower shares striking similarities with structures across the Atlantic. In particular, it echoes the design of the round church at Tamar in Portugal, built by the Templars in the 12th century, and the round church in Orfeer, Scotland. Both are circular, both employ arches supported by pillars. Both suggest a symbolism of the circle, the shape of eternity, of the cosmos, of God's perfection. Could it be that the Newport Tower, thousands of miles from these sites, was built by men who carried the same traditions? When the first European colonists arrived in Rhode Island in the 1600s, the tower was already standing, or so some accounts suggest. That detail alone casts doubt on the orthodox story. If the structure predates the colonists, then who built it? The Norse explorers, who we know reached Newfoundland in the year 1000, the Portuguese navigators, quietly mapping the coasts long before Columbus, or the Templars themselves, fleeing persecution in the early 1300s and carrying their secrets to a new world. Adding fuel to the fire are the tower's astronomical alignments. Researchers have shown that certain windows and openings in the tower line up with solar events. The rising sun on winter solstice, the light of the full moon at specific times. These are not random coincidences. They suggest deliberate design. The hand of builders who saw architecture not merely as shelter, but as instrumental way to harmonize stone with sky, earth with heaven. This is not unusual for medieval builders. In Europe, cathedrals were often aligned with the solstices and equinoxes. Their stained glass illuminated on holy days with almost theatrical precision. If the Newport Tower were part of this tradition, then it was far more than a windmill. It was a temple, an observatory, a marker of cosmic order transplanted into the new world. And then there is the geometry. The tower's proportions appear to echo ratios used in sacred architecture, the golden mean, the recurrence of the number 8, the balance of circle and square. To the Templars and later the Freemasons, geometry was not just mathematics, it was theology written in number and form, the mind of God expressed through stone. The Newport Tower, with its 8 arches and circular plan, hums with this resonance. If the Templars or men carrying their legacy built such a structure in Rhode Island, it would fit into a broader pattern, from the Kensington Runestone in Minnesota to the Westford Knight in Massachusetts, from the mysterious Oak Island in Nova Scotia to Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. A constellation of sites suggests hidden voyages, secret traditions, and geometry encoded into the landscape. The Newport Tower, standing in the heart of New England, becomes a linchpin in this constellation, a visible, undeniable structure that refuses to be explained away. But skeptics remain unmoved. They point out that Governor Benedict Arnold lived nearby and had reason to build a sturdy windmill. They note that the stonework lacks the precision of European round churches. They argue that colonial builders could easily have mimicked European styles, without it implying hidden voyages. To them, the tower is a curiosity, nothing more. And yet, those who stand beneath its arches often come away unsettled. The columns are massive, the stone thick, the air within charged with an almost chapel-like stillness. When sunlight falls through its openings, illuminating the chamber above, the effect feels less like machinery and more like ritual. It is as though the tower remembers something we have forgotten. Local lore has long surrounded the tower. Some called it the Old Stone Mill. Some believed it was built by Norsemen. Others whispered of Templar voyages. even America's founding fathers were intrigued. In 1837, Danish historian Carl Christian Raffn argued that the tower was evidence of Norse presence in America, tying it to sagas of Leif Erikson and Vinland. The idea captured imaginations, fueling the belief that the tower stood as a monument to voyages across the Atlantic long before Columbus. The tower's role as a mystery goes beyond its stones. It has become a mirror for our own desires about history. If you wish to believe that America was a blank slate before Columbus, you will call it a colonial windmill. If you long to believe in secret voyages, hidden brotherhoods, and mysteries encoded in architecture, you will see it as a Templar chapel. Both readings say as much about us as they do about the tower. But what if the truth lies between? What if colonial builders adapted an older structure already standing? What if local knowledge of Norse visitors survived in whispers, influencing the design? What if Masonic traditions, alive among early settlers, inspired the tower's geometry? In that middle ground, the tower becomes not a binary puzzle of colonial windmill versus Templar chapel, but a palimpsest, a layered text written over centuries, each generation adding its mark. Standing before it today, you cannot help but feel that the tower is less interested in answering questions than in provoking them. Its arches frame the sky, inviting you to look upward. Its circle encloses you, inviting you inward. Its stone holds silence, but also the echo of voices, colonists, Norsemen, Templars, seekers. Skeptics saw woven into its story. What does it mean that such a structure stands in America? It means that history is never finished, never final. It means that the past is stranger than we imagine, that stones can hold secrets, that architecture can outlive memory. It means that every generation must decide what to see in the tower, a windmill, a temple, or a mystery, and perhaps that is its true power. For more than 3 centuries, the Newport Tower has stood, resisting categorization, defying explanation. Whether it was built by colonists, Norsemen, or Templars, it has become a symbol of America's hidden past, a reminder that history is not only what we record, but also what we forget, what we overlook, what we dismiss. And sometimes, the most ordinary-looking ruins turn out to be the most extraordinary. So when we place the Newport Tower alongside the Kensington Runestone, we begin to see not isolated curiosities, but a network, a trail of enigmas stretching across the continent. Each site whispers of voyages and traditions that official history does not acknowledge. Each invites us to look again, to reconsider what we thought we knew. And if the tower is part of that network, then what story does it tell? A story of stone and sky, of arches and light, of men who carried secrets across oceans and left them standing in plain view. A story of a structure that refuses to be reduced to utility, that insists on being seen as symbol. A story that will not let go of our imagination. The Newport Tower still stands, and so does the mystery. The Newport Tower does not stand alone. If it were merely one strange ruin, it could be dismissed as eccentricity, as a quirk of colonial architecture or the accident of some long-forgotten builder's whim. But it is not alone. It stands as part of a larger constellation of mysteries, a chain of puzzles stretching across oceans and centuries, a series of breadcrumbs scattered through the forests and shorelines of North America. The more one studies the tower, the harder it is to keep it isolated from this wider pattern. A round stone tower with Templar-like geometry is remarkable enough, but when we place it next to the Kensington Runestone, with its strange Norse Templar runes in Minnesota, or the carving of a medieval knight at Westford in Massachusetts, or the star-mapped mysteries of Oak Island in Nova Scotia, suddenly the pattern begins to emerge. Suddenly, the tower does not look like an outlier. It looks like part of a plan. This plan, or at least the suggestion of one, has been called many things. The hidden codex of the Templars, the Atlantic legacy, the geometry of the Venus families. Whatever name we give it, the idea is the same, that before Columbus, before Cabot, before the voyages that we are told began the European chapter of the Americas, there were other journeys, secret ones, voyages that carried not just men, but symbols, rituals, and geometry, voyages that planted not colonies, but clues. To understand the Newport Tower in this larger framework, we must step back and ask, who were the Templars, really? And why would they cross an ocean in silence? The Knights Templar began as a small band of warriors in the early 1100s, charged with protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land. Within a century, they had become a global power. Bankers, builders, soldiers, mystics, their white mantles with the Red Cross struck fear in battle. Their network of preceptories stretched across Europe. Their knowledge of geometry and sacred architecture shaped the cathedrals of Christendom. They were, in a sense, the first truly international organization of the West. But in 1307, their world collapsed. On a single October morning, the French king ordered the arrest of every Templar in his realm, torture, accusations of heresy. Confessions wrung by force, all of it broke the order's power. Officially, the Templars were dissolved. Unofficially, many slipped into the shadows. Some found refuge in Scotland, protected by the excommunicated King Robert the Bruce. Some melted into other orders, carrying their knowledge quietly. And some, if the legends are true, took to the sea. The Templars had fleets, they had ports, they had wealth hidden beyond the reach of kings, and they had motive, survival. If they could no longer build openly in Europe, perhaps they would carry their secrets westward. Two lands spoken of in Norse sagas, lands that may have already been charted by explorers long before Columbus. The Newport Tower, in this telling, is no accident. It is a chapel, a temple, a signal left in stone. It tells us we were here. But how does one connect Rhode Island to the larger Templar web? The key lies in geometry and alignment. Researchers like William Mann and Scott Wolter have argued that Templar voyages followed not random routes, but paths dictated by sacred geometry, triangles, stars, and the cycles of the planet Venus, just as medieval builders oriented their cathedrals to celestial events. So too did the Templars align their hidden sites across the Atlantic world. Take Oak Island in Nova Scotia. Its infamous money pit has lured treasure hunters for centuries. Yet beneath the legends of gold lies something more subtle, a network of tunnels, flood traps, and designs that echo Masonic and Templar symbolism. Some theorists argue that Oak Island was not merely a hiding place for treasure, but a marker, a node in the larger geometry stretching from Europe to the Americas. From Oak Island, the alignments run to the Newport Tower. From Newport, they stretch to the Westford Knight, the carved figure of a medieval warrior etched into stone in Massachusetts. And from there, they point inland to Minnesota and the Kensington Runestone. The pattern is not random, it is deliberate. A map written not on parchment, but on the very landscape of North America. If true, then the Newport Tower is not just an isolated structure. It is a lighthouse in stone, a coordinate in a network of sites that spans a continent. Of course, the skeptic raises a fair question. Why? Why would the Templars, or any medieval order, go to such lengths to carve runes, to build towers, to encode alignments into forests and coastlines? What purpose would it serve? The answer lies in their worldview. To the Templars, architecture was not merely functional. It was sacred. Every stone, every angle, every measure was infused with meaning. A tower was never just a tower, it was a bridge between heaven and earth, a resonance chamber for prayer, a beacon for the initiated. By building in America, they were not colonizing land in the modern sense. They were sanctifying it, consecrating it, preparing it for a destiny that only they understood. Some suggest they were protecting something, perhaps relics from the Holy Land, perhaps knowledge deemed too dangerous for medieval Europe, perhaps even the bloodline of Christ itself. If we follow the more speculative currents of Grail lore, others suggest they were preparing a new Jerusalem, a land free of the corruption of kings and popes, where their traditions could survive in secrecy. In this light, the Newport Tower is not a ruin, but a prophecy in stone. The colonists who later stumbled upon it may have thought it a windmill, but for those who built it, it was a cipher, a message left for those who knew how to read geometry and light. The tower also ties into another strand, the mysterious Zeno Map, created in the 1500s. The Zeno Map depicted parts of the North Atlantic with surprising accuracy, long before official exploration. Some believe it is evidence of Templar-descended voyages, preserved in secret traditions of Venetian or Scottish families. When placed against the Newport Tower, the map seems less like an anomaly and more like another piece of the hidden legacy. It is here that the story begins to blur. On one hand, we have the skeptical, rationalist lens. The Newport Tower is a colonial windmill, the Kensington Runestone a hoax, Oak Island a folly. On the other, we have the esoteric vision, a continent marked by geometry, sanctified by secret orders, written over with stone ciphers and alignments of stars. Both interpretations wrestle for dominance, and in the middle, we are left with the undeniable fact that these things exist. The tower exists, the Runestone exists, Oak Island exists, the Westford Knight exists. Whatever their origin, they demand explanation. Perhaps that is the deeper point. These sites endure because they provoke us, because they open the door to alternative histories. They remind us that history is not only what is recorded, but also what is erased, what is suppressed, what is forgotten. The Newport Tower, then, becomes a crossroads. Do we accept the orthodox narrative in which America's story begins in 1492, with Columbus stepping onto Caribbean shores, or do we dare to imagine a deeper history, in which stone towers and rune-carved slabs whisper of journeys across the sea centuries earlier? Standing beneath its arches, one cannot help but feel that the tower leans toward the latter. Its geometry, its presence, its strange refusal to fit into the neat boxes of colonial architecture, all of it hints at something more. And when you place it within the constellation of mysteries across North America, it becomes a star in a larger sky, a signal fire in a network of forgotten voyages, a reminder that the past is far more layered, far more mysterious than we were ever taught. The Newport Tower tells us that history is not finished. It is still being written, and perhaps, if we are willing to follow its clues, it may lead us toward the greatest secret of all, that America's story began not in 1492, but long before, carried across oceans by men in white mantles and red crosses, men who left their mark not in chronicles, but in stone. The tower still stands, waiting for us to decide what story we will believe. The story of Rosslyn Chapel begins in silence, not the silence of neglect, but the silence of awe, the kind that steals words from the tongue and replaces them with wonder. Travelers who step into its vaulted stone interior, just outside Edinburgh, in Scotland, describe the sensation as stepping into another world. Sunlight filters through stained glass onto columns carved with spirals, angels, vines, and symbols so intricate that the chapel feels less like a church and more like a manuscript, written in stone. Every surface, every inch of wall and arch and pillar speaks in a language of symbols. To the casual visitor, it is breathtaking. To the historian, it is baffling. For Rosslyn is not a typical medieval chapel. It is a labyrinth, a codex, a riddle, cast in stone. And at the heart of this riddle lie carvings that should not exist. Among the foliage winding up its stone arches are carvings unmistakably depicting plants from the Americas, plants that Europe should not have known until after Columbus set sail in 1492. Corn, with its distinctive kernels and leaves, aloe, with its spiny fronds, even cactus-like forms. They are not vague. They are not general. They are specific, etched with the precision of an artist who had seen them with his own eyes. How could they be there, in Scotland, in the 1440s? The official story of the chapel is tied to one family, the Sinclairs, a powerful Scottish clan with deep ties to the Knights Templar. William Sinclair, the patron of Rosslyn, was a man of learning, wealth, and ambition. He commissioned the chapel as both a place of worship and a testament to knowledge. His family's legacy had long been whispered about in connection to the Templars, particularly after the suppression of the order in 1307. While the Templars vanished in France, many are believed to have found refuge in Scotland, protected by Robert the Bruce, who had himself been excommunicated by the Pope. The Sinclairs, staunch allies of Bruce, were perfectly placed to shelter fugitive knights and preserve their traditions. Thus, when William Sinclair set out to build his chapel, some suggest he was not simply creating a church, he was encoding a legacy. He was chiseling into stone the symbols, the geometry, the wisdom, and perhaps even the history of the Templars. The carvings of American plants fit perfectly into this narrative. If the Templars or their descendants through the Sinclairs had indeed crossed the Atlantic, if they had mapped lands across the ocean, if they had returned with knowledge of crops and herbs unknown in Europe, then Rosslyn Chapel is where they chose to preserve that knowledge, not in books that could burn, not in oral traditions that could fade, but in stone, where it might endure for centuries, awaiting rediscovery. The corn carving is particularly striking. Maize was unknown in Europe until after Columbus. There is no plausible way for a 15th century Scottish stonemason to imagine it by accident. Its tall stalk, segmented nodes, and distinctive cobs are unmistakable. Aloe vera, too, was not a crop of medieval Scotland. Yet there it is in Rosslyn, carved with botanical accuracy to some. This is proof stone-hard evidence that pre-Columbian contact between Europe and the Americas occurred, and that the Templars were part of it. To others, it is a coincidence or a misidentification. Skeptics argue the carvings depict stylized wheat, artistic foliage, or symbolic plants rather than literal corn. But the longer one studies them, the more that skepticism strains. For the Rosslyn carvers did not work in vague flourishes. Every leaf, every curve, every spiral in the chapel is intentional, specific, and symbolically loaded. If they carved corn, it is because they knew corn. But Rosslyn holds more than plants. Its carvings are a vast encyclopedia of sacred geometry and esoteric symbolism. Serpents coil along arches, angels play instruments, knights kneel in stone. Pentagrams, intertwined patterns, and hidden green men stare from the walls. Every column tells a story. The apprentice pillar, for instance, is wrapped in vines said to represent the tree of life, connecting heaven and earth. Legends whisper that the master mason, jealous of his apprentice's skill, killed him in rage, an allegory of hidden knowledge lost and betrayed. Taken together, Rosslyn reads like a Templar codex. Its language is not words, but shapes, not ink but stone. To those who can read geometry, it tells of star alignments, sacred measures, and mysteries stretching back to Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, the spiritual heart of the Templar order. Now imagine that William Sinclair was not merely preserving symbols of the old world, but also encoding a map to the new. Imagine that Rosslyn Chapel was meant to be a repository of both history and prophecy, history of what had already been achieved, and prophecy of a destiny yet to unfold across the Atlantic. Some theorists point to the Sinclair voyages themselves. Henry Sinclair, an ancestor of William, is said to have sailed to North America in the late 1300s, nearly a century before Columbus. This claim rests on accounts of the Zeno brothers, Venetian navigators, whose map depicts parts of the North Atlantic with surprising accuracy. According to this story, Henry Sinclair's expedition reached Nova Scotia, where some of his men carved stones, left markers, and interacted with local peoples. Native oral traditions in the region tell of pale-skinned visitors who arrived by sea, bringing knowledge and strange symbols. If true, then Henry Sinclair may have planted the seeds of a hidden history in America, seeds that his descendant William chose to enshrine in Roslyn. The chapel becomes not merely a church, but a bridge across oceans, a stone link between Scotland and Nova Scotia, between Templars and America. This interpretation deepens when we return to Oak Island. For centuries, treasure hunters have dug into its earth, seeking gold, manuscripts, relics. What they have found instead are layers of design, flood tunnels, coconut fiber, platforms of oak. The island bears the fingerprints of advanced engineering, as if a group skilled in subterranean construction like the Templars had buried something there. And Oak Island lies directly across the Atlantic from the Sinclair lands. It is almost as if Roslyn Chapel is the key and Oak Island the lock. Together, they form a code, one in stone in Scotland, one in earth in Nova Scotia. And between them lies the story of hidden voyages, carried across the sea by men who knew their mission must remain secret until the right time. Why the secrecy? Why not announce such voyages openly? The answer lies in the world of the 14th and 15th centuries. Europe was a dangerous place for heresy, for secrets, for knowledge outside the Church's control. The Templars had already been crushed once by kings and popes jealous of their power. To reveal their survival, their voyages, or their treasures would invite the same fate again. Better to encode the truth, hide it in plain sight, and entrust it to symbols only the initiated could read. Roslyn Chapel, then, is less a public monument than a time capsule. It speaks not to its own century, but to ours. It whispers of knowledge buried, of voyages concealed, of a destiny waiting for rediscovery. Even the architecture reinforces this. Roslyn is not laid out like a simple parish church. Its proportions echo sacred geometry found in Solomon's temple, in Gothic cathedrals, in Templar commanderies. Its very ground plan is a cipher, a geometry of hidden knowledge. The play of light through its windows on solstices and equinoxes suggests an awareness of celestial cycles, perhaps the same cycles the Templars are said to have mapped with Venus and the stars. Step inside Roslyn, and you are not in a church. You are in a library of stone. You are inside a message, and the message points west. The corn, the aloe, the cactus, these are not idle decorations. They are signposts. They tell us the builders of this chapel knew of lands across the ocean. They knew of crops and herbs that had no business in 15th century Scotland. They chose to preserve this knowledge not in parchment that could be burned, but in stone that would last. They did not expect their contemporaries to understand. They expected us. To stand in Roslyn today is to feel the weight of that legacy. The silence of its stone columns is not empty, it is waiting. Waiting for the initiated, for those who can read symbols, to piece together the story. The Templars may have vanished from history's official stage, but their voice still whispers in the chapel's carvings. And when we follow that whisper across the sea, to Oak Island, to the Newport Tower, to the Kensington Runestone and the Westford Knight, the pattern becomes undeniable. Roslyn is the Rosetta Stone of this mystery, the key that unlocks the others. The official historian may dismiss it as coincidence, as misinterpretation, but deep down, standing beneath those arches, gazing at the corn that should not exist. One feels the possibility stir, the possibility that history is not what we have been told, the possibility that long before Columbus, the Atlantic was crossed, not once, not by accident, but deliberately by men who left their mark in stone, in code, in mystery. Rosslyn Chapel remains, not as a relic of the past, but as a challenge to the present. Its carvings ask us, will you listen? Will you see? Will you accept the narrow version of history handed down by kings and chroniclers, or will you dare to read the stones themselves? For in the end, Rosslyn is not just a chapel, it is a question. And like all the greatest questions, it is carved in silence, waiting for us to answer. The Scottish chapel fades behind us, but its whisper still lingers, pointing westward across the Atlantic. And so, we follow that thread out of stone, across ocean, into the deep forests of North America. Here, amid farmland and glacial plains, another puzzle waits. If Rosslyn's carvings were the encoded whispers of a transatlantic crossing, then the Kensington Runestone may be the voice itself, carved not in decorative stone but in raw declaration. The year was 1898. A farmer named Olaf Oman, working the hard soil of Minnesota, made a discovery that would ignite more than a century of debate. His spade struck something beneath the roots of a poplar tree, and as he dug further, he uncovered a rectangular slab of gray stone, about 30 inches long and 16 wide. The surface was carved with strange letters, rows of runes etched deeply into its face. At first, he assumed it was nothing more than a curiosity, perhaps a prank, or an artifact from Scandinavian settlers of recent decades. But as word spread, scholars, linguists, and enthusiasts descended to study it. What they read astonished them. The inscription, written in a form of runic script, told a story. It spoke of an expedition in the year 1362. A group of Norsemen, 8 Gatlanders and 22 Norwegians, had ventured into the heart of North America. 2 weeks from their camp by the sea, they recorded that 10 of their party were slain by red men, while the survivors carved this message into stone to mark their tragedy. They were, the inscription said, far from their homeland, stranded in the wilderness, explorers of a continent long before Columbus. Immediately, the stones split opinion. Could it be real? Could Vikings or Norse explorers, or even Templars, disguised as Norse, have left this carved testimony in Minnesota centuries before European discovery? Or was it a clever forgery, a 19th century farmer's hoax designed to amuse, deceive, or elevate immigrant pride? For over a century, the debate has raged. Linguists argued that the runes used were anachronistic, blending medieval and modern forms. Historians scoffed at the idea of Norse parties venturing so far inland. Yet defenders pointed to weathering on the stone, to authentic linguistic quirks, to the detail of its account. And then there was the hooked X among the runes carved on the Kensington stone. Certain letters bore an unusual feature. The X symbol, a common rune, had an extra hook carved onto one of its arms, transforming it into a variant unknown in most rune traditions. This hooked X, once dismissed as an odd mistake or careless flourish, soon emerged as the centerpiece of the mystery. For this very symbol appears in other contexts bound not to Norse farmers, but to secret traditions, sacred geometry, and even the hidden legacies of the Knights Templar. Researcher and explorer Scott Wolter, among others, has argued that the hooked X is a sacred mark, a symbol used by Templars and later by Freemasons to denote a secret lineage, a connection to esoteric knowledge. On gravestones, manuscripts, and artifacts, the hooked X surfaces as a quiet signature of those in possession of hidden truths. Its presence on the Kensington Runestone, then, cannot easily be explained away as accident. Instead, it suggests that the stone is not simply a Norse relic, but something more profound. A coded message left by men tied to the Templar current, inscribing their journey into the American wilderness. But why Minnesota? Why inland, far from the Atlantic coast? Some suggest that the explorers followed rivers deep into the continent, seeking passageways and resources. Others propose that Minnesota lay along a route of sacred geography, aligned with celestial or earthly markers known to those who traveled not only by compass, but by star and symbol. In this reading, the Runestone is not a random marker of tragedy, but a node in a network of encoded sites, stretching across North America. The very discovery of the stone adds layers to the mystery. When Oman unearthed it, the stone was bound beneath roots estimated to be at least a century old. How could a recent hoaxer have buried it so deeply, then allowed a tree to grow undisturbed for decades above it? And why would a simple farmer, with little formal education, invent such a complex story in archaic runes? The idea of an elaborate forgery becomes difficult to sustain under scrutiny. Yet mainstream academia remains skeptical. To accept the Runestone as authentic would be to rewrite centuries of history. To admit that Norse explorers or their allies penetrated the North American interior in the 14th century. It would shatter the narrative of Columbus as the discoverer of the New World and expose a forgotten chapter of transatlantic contact. For some, that possibility is too disruptive, too destabilizing to acknowledge, and so the Runestone remains liminal, straddling belief and dismissal. But look again at the hooked X. Its persistence across artifacts cannot be ignored. In Europe, the symbol appears carved into Templar graves, etched into manuscripts tied to esoteric sects. In America, it reemerges on the Runestone, on other disputed inscriptions, and even in architectural elements of colonial Masonic lodges. The line stretches like a thread, weaving together Templar secrecy, Norse voyages, and the Runestone's message. What if the Kensington Stone was not merely the lament of a doomed expedition, but a declaration of presence, carved to last? We were here, it says, in runes that whisper across centuries. We crossed, we camped, we suffered, we recorded. And in the hooked X, it leaves a signature, a calling card of those who carried forward the flame of forbidden knowledge. Minnesota, far from the sea, becomes a crucible of history. The Runestone stands as a challenge, a stone book that refuses to be silenced. Its presence forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Who truly discovered America? How many voyages were made in secret, hidden from official chronicles? And how much knowledge of the New World was known in Europe before Columbus set sail under the Spanish flag? For some, the Runestone is a forgery. For others, it is the single most important artifact of pre-Columbian contact. But for those who look deeper, who follow the hooked X and the Templar threads, it becomes something more, a revelation in stone, a bridge between Rossland's carvings and Oak Island's mystery, between sacred geometry and the forests of America. It is a puzzle piece that fits perfectly into the hidden map of history, if only one dares to see it. And so, the Kensington Runestone sits in quiet defiance. Its runes, carved by hands long vanished, stare back at us. Are they the desperate words of Norse explorers lost in a hostile land, or are they the encoded mark of a secret order, declaring that the New World was known, mapped, claimed, and preserved long before Columbus ever set sail? The stone waits, as Rossland waits, as Oak Island waits, and in their silence, they call to us. They demand that we question what we think we know. They demand that we look beyond the official story and into the shadows, where forgotten voices carved their truths into stone and left them for the future. Perhaps one day, the Runestone will yield its full meaning. Perhaps we will learn who carved it, and why, and how they came to Minnesota in 1362. Until then, it remains what it has always been, a riddle in stone, a challenge to history, a whisper of lost voyages, and in the hooked X, it bears the unmistakable mark of a tradition that has never fully died, a tradition that encoded its secrets not in books, but in stone, waiting for us to listen. The Kensington Runestone lies silent in its glass case now, a relic many pass by without a second thought. But for those who pause, who look carefully, the carved hooked X glimmers like a beacon. It is not only an inscription, but a key, and keys, as the Templars themselves knew, always open something. The question is, what? If we follow the hooked X, it does not remain in Minnesota. It leads outward, across landscapes and across centuries, into a vast pattern few dare to see. For hidden within geography itself, within the placement of monuments, stones, chapels, and even towns, is a system of alignments that whispers of an intelligence greater than chance. This is the world of sacred geometry, the old science of proportion, alignment, and cosmic resonance. And it is here, in the intersections of stone and star, that the Runestone may find its true context. For those who have studied these mysteries, one family name emerges again and again: Sinclair. The same family that built Rosslyn Chapel, that sponsored voyages to unknown lands, and that preserved the Templar flame long after the Order's official suppression. In their bloodline and in their alliances runs a thread of esoteric knowledge. But the Sinclairs were not alone. Scattered across Europe were families who also carried forward these traditions. Some called them the Venus families, a poetic name for bloodlines tied not only by noble status, but by devotion to a certain astronomical principle, the planet Venus. Why Venus? Because Venus, to those who observed the heavens with patient devotion, revealed a pattern unlike any other. Over an 8-year cycle, Venus traces a pentagram in the sky, a 5-pointed star formed by its conjunctions with Earth and the Sun. This star became a symbol of harmony, beauty, and secret knowledge. To the ancients, Venus was the morning star, the bringer of light. To esoteric traditions, it was the emblem of the perfected human, the microcosm reflecting the macrocosm. To the Templars and their heirs, it was geometry incarnate. The Venus families, so the theory goes, carried this knowledge in their blood and their symbols. They aligned chapels to Venus risings, constructed towns on pentagonal grids, and encoded their devotion to sacred geometry in everything they touched. When the Templars fled persecution in Europe, these families sheltered them, allied with them, and eventually joined them in their quiet expansion westward. And if they did reach America, their marks would be written not only in stones like the Kensington Runestone, but in the very landscape itself. Consider the Newport Tower in Rhode Island, that circular stone structure long debated as colonial windmill or medieval relic. To most, it is an oddity. To those who study sacred geometry, it is a key site. Its windows and arches align with solstices and lunar standstills, its proportions echoing European traditions of astronomical architecture. If the Runestone tells us explorers reached inland Minnesota, the Newport Tower tells us they first anchored on the eastern seaboard. Both artifacts, together, form the bones of a hidden map. But the map is not only physical, it is celestial. For the Runestone's inscription of 1362 does more than date an expedition. It ties the stone to cycles of Venus visible in that very century, cycles that may have guided voyagers across the sea. Imagine a group of men, not only Norse sailors but initiates of Templar mysteries, charting their journey not by chance winds but by the morning star, mapping rivers and forests as extensions of the geometry they had studied in Europe. For them, America was not a wilderness, but a canvas, a landscape upon which to extend their sacred science. It is in Nova Scotia that these theories reach their most tantalizing form. Oak Island, with its infamous money pit, may be a burial ground not for treasure but for geometry itself, a vast engineering project encoding ratios, distances, and alignments tied to Venus cycles. Nearby sites, stone crosses, grave markers, petroglyphs reveal patterns when mapped, forming pentagonal alignments that mirror the sky. To dismiss them as coincidence is tempting, but coincidences repeated across continents become something else, a pattern, and in this pattern, the Venus families emerge again. Some researchers suggest that the Sinclairs, St. Clairs, and allied houses deliberately encoded their voyages into North America with geometric markers, ensuring that those who followed in their footsteps, if they carried the knowledge, would be able to decode the map. The Kensington Runestone, then, is not only a message of tragedy, but a waypoint. Its hooked X a signature that tells the initiated, yes, you are on the path. Skeptics scoff. They point out that human beings see patterns everywhere, that sacred geometry can be imposed upon any landscape by creative minds. And yet, what they cannot easily dismiss are the alignments that predate colonial settlement, the carvings that show pentagrams and hooked X's where no European hand should have placed them. They cannot explain why chapels like Rosslyn encode American plants in their stonework. They cannot explain why families tied to Templar legacies financed voyages westward in the centuries before Columbus. What if the Runestone, the Tower, and Oak Island are not isolated anomalies but stations on a pilgrimage? What if the Venus families and their Templar allies created a new world network, a sacred geography stretching from Nova Scotia to Minnesota, from coastal towers to inland stones? Their purpose may not have been conquest but preservation of knowledge, of sacred science, of a vision of the world where heaven and earth align. In this light, the hooked X takes on deeper meaning. It is not only a letter but a symbol, the X of crossing, of intersection, hooked into connection with the divine. Some interpret it as a symbol of the union of masculine and feminine, the balance of opposites, the alchemical marriage. On the Runestone, it marks not only words, but identity, the identity of those who carved their truth into the wilderness. Imagine, then, the scene. It is 1362. A band of explorers, Scandinavians, perhaps, but also initiates, pushes inland, along rivers and lakes. They carry not only swords but compasses, not only provisions but charts of Venus cycles. When tragedy strikes and 10 of their number fall, they do what their order has always done. They mark the place with stone, inscribed with the secret symbols of their tradition. They do not expect the world to read it, only their successors. For them, the land itself is alive with geometry, and their stone is a node in that network. Centuries later, when Olaf Oman uncovers it, the world is no longer prepared to understand. Scholars trained in a narrow history declare it fake, because it does not fit the sanctioned narrative. But those who know the signs, the hooked X, the Venus alignments, the sacred geometry, see in it the echo of something profound. They see a fragment of a map that spans oceans. This is the tragedy of forbidden history, that the pieces lie scattered before us, but to assemble them demands the courage to question the official story. The Kensington Runestone is dismissed because it dares to suggest knowledge we are told could not exist. The Newport Tower is dismissed because it does not fit the colonial record. Rosslyn Chapel's carvings are dismissed as coincidence. Oak Island is dismissed as fantasy. And yet, when viewed together, these fragments form a tapestry too consistent to ignore. The Venus families, bound by blood and secrecy, carried forward a vision of the world where heaven and earth reflected each other. To preserve this, they encoded it into stone, into architecture, into alignments across the Atlantic. Their voyage to America was not the whim of adventurers, but the extension of a sacred duty. And the Kensington Runestone, though scorned, may be their clearest declaration. We came, we marked, we remembered. As night falls over Minnesota, one can imagine the explorers standing in silence before their stone. The forest presses in, the air heavy with grief. They carve their runes carefully, ensuring the hooked X marks their presence. They bury it beneath a tree, not to hide it but to protect it, knowing the land will one day yield it up. They leave or perish or vanish into history, but their stone remains, awaiting discovery. And when it is found, it does what it was meant to do. It unsettles, it confuses, it forces us to ask, who knew of America long before Columbus? What networks of geometry and astronomy spanned oceans? What families carried this hidden science across centuries? The Runestone has not failed. It has succeeded, for we are still talking about it, still puzzling, still searching. From Rossland to Minnesota, from Venus to Oak Island, the line holds, the hooked X still glimmers, a symbol of connection across time. And in the Venus families, we glimpse the custodians of a truth too dangerous for official history, but too important to be lost. Their geometry lives on, etched in stone, aligned with stars. Whispered through bloodlines, the pattern remains, waiting for those who dare to see. On a quiet hill in Midlothian, just south of Edinburgh, there stands a chapel that feels less like a building and more like a riddle. From the outside, it has undeniably medieval arched windows, buttresses, stone walls weathered by centuries of Scottish rain. But the moment you step inside, it becomes something else entirely. Rossland Chapel is not a simple parish church. It is a labyrinth of stone, a library without paper, a manuscript carved into pillars and arches. It is a place where every inch of stone seems to speak, every carving a symbol, every shadow hinting at a secret just beyond our grasp. And in its carvings, its geometry, and its legends lies one of the most unsettling questions in history. Did Rossland Chapel record knowledge of America long before Columbus ever sailed west? The story begins with the family who built it, the Sinclairs. Unlike many noble families of the 15th century, the Sinclairs were not just lords of land and title. They were keepers of secrets. Their lineage stretched back to Norman knights who had fought beside William the Conqueror, but their true legacy was something stranger. When the Knights Templar were destroyed in 1307, when their leaders were burned in Paris and their order dissolved across Europe, Scotland became one of the few places where the Templars found refuge. The country was in conflict with England, and the Scots had little reason to hand fugitives over to the English crown. Some traditions hold that Templars came north, their ships docking in Orkney, their treasures hidden in the Highlands, their rituals and knowledge sheltered by sympathetic lords. Among those lords, the Sinclairs were said to play a crucial role. By the time William Sinclair, 1st Earl of Caithness, laid the foundations of Rossland Chapel in the 1440s, his family carried both the prestige of nobility and the whispers of an esoteric inheritance. William did not build an ordinary chapel. He built a sanctuary designed to last centuries, one that would preserve in stone what could not be spoken aloud. He employed master masons not just for their craftsmanship but for their knowledge of geometry, proportion, and symbol. The result was a building that looks, at first glance, like decoration gone mad, every inch covered in vines, angels, knights, dragons, musicians, and endless floral motifs. But the deeper you look, the less it seems like random ornament, and the more it feels like deliberate code. Among these carvings are plants that should not exist there. In niches and arches, scholars have identified what appear unmistakably to be maize corn, with its rows of kernels and aloe, and even cactus. To a modern visitor, these are unremarkable. To a botanist in the 15th century, they would have been impossible. Corn was native to the Americas. Europe, by all accepted accounts, did not encounter it until Columbus brought it back after 1492, 50 years after Roslin's foundation stone was laid. Yet here it is, unmistakably present, carved in stone. Skeptics insist the masons may have meant something else, some European plant that merely resembles maize. But the detail is too precise. The kernels sit in neat rows. The leaves arc in distinctive shapes. The cactus bristles with thorny edges. It is not generic foliage. It is America, carved in Scotland before Europe was meant to know of it. This single detail opens a chasm in history. If the carvings are what they appear to be, then someone, perhaps the Sinclairs themselves, had already seen the New World. Someone had knowledge that official history says could not have existed. And if Roslin preserves this in stone, then it is not merely a chapel, it is testimony. But Roslin's mysteries go deeper still. The very proportions of the building are strange. Scholars of sacred geometry have noted that its layout reflects mathematical ratios prized in esoteric traditions: the golden mean, the Fibonacci sequence, the pentagram traced by the orbit of Venus, the placement of pillars, the spacing of windows, the relationship between length and width all resonate with patterns that medieval masons believed echoed the harmony of the cosmos itself. To a casual observer, this is architecture. To an initiate, it is symbol, the language of hidden wisdom, made manifest in stone. One pillar, above all, captures attention, the so-called apprentice pillar. Its spirals twine upward in an elaborate dance, carved with patterns that resemble twisting vines or, to modern eyes, even the double helix of DNA. Legend says that a master mason left for a journey and forbade his apprentice to carve it. The apprentice, inspired by a vision, completed the work alone. When the master returned, he was so overcome with jealousy that he struck the apprentice dead. The story may be allegory, but the pillar itself is remarkable. Its spirals are precise, almost mathematical, as if they encode knowledge of forms centuries ahead of their time. Roslin's carvings also echo Templar imagery: knights on horseback, swords, crosses, angels with swords, symbols that recall an order that had officially ceased to exist more than a century earlier. Some even claim that depictions of the Ark of the Covenant appear in hidden corners. The chapel's sealed crypt, unopened for centuries, has only fueled speculation. Some whisper that it contains relics brought from the Holy Land, perhaps even the Grail itself, concealed by Templars and entrusted to the Sinclairs. Overlaying all of this are Masonic symbols: compasses, squares, the beehive, the all-seeing eye. These appear centuries before Freemasonry formally emerged in the historical record. Some suggest that Roslin was a bridge, the place where Templar traditions survived and evolved into what would later become Freemasonry. If true, Roslin is not merely a chapel but a hinge in history, the moment where one secret order gave birth to another. And then there is the theory of Henry Sinclair, grandfather of William, who is said to have sailed west in 1398. According to the Zeno narrative, Venetian navigators allied with him charted a course across the Atlantic, landing in Nova Scotia. They built settlements, interacted with the Micmac, and returned with knowledge of the new land. If Henry Sinclair truly made that voyage, then his descendants, carving maize and cactus into Roslin's walls, were leaving proof. They knew, they had seen, and they ensured their knowledge was not lost, encoding it in stone for those who came after. Some researchers go further still, arguing that Roslin itself is a kind of map. Its proportions, when projected outward, align with transatlantic distances, pointing toward Nova Scotia and even Oak Island. The chapel becomes not just a building, but a chart, a stone compass designed to direct initiates toward hidden knowledge. Across the ocean, Mainstream historians dismiss such claims as fantasy, but the coincidences stack one atop another. The carvings of American plants, the sacred geometry, the Templar echoes, the Sinclair Voyages. Dismissed individually, they might be shrugged away. Together, they begin to form a pattern. Today, Rosslyn remains alive. Tourists walk through its nave, cameras flashing, gazing up at the apprentice pillar. Guides tell tales of Grail legends, of Masons and Templars, of buried treasures beneath the crypt. Scholars debate, skeptics scoff, believers linger. Yet the chapel itself does not answer. It keeps its secrets in silence, allowing us only glimpses. It is a stone book that never closes, a manuscript whose meaning depends on the reader. Perhaps the maze is proof of pre-Columbian voyages. Perhaps it is a symbol of something more abstract: fertility, abundance, the promise of a new world of ideas. Perhaps the geometry encoded in its structure was less about navigation and more about reminding us that the universe itself has harmony, that sacred proportion is a language of the divine. But whatever its meaning, Rosslyn refuses to fit into the neat margins of official history. It unsettles, it challenges, it teases. It insists that history is stranger, deeper, and more interconnected than we have been taught. And so Rosslyn stands, its stones weathered but unbroken, its carvings still whispering. It remains a riddle, carved in shadow and light, refusing to be explained away, daring us to look again and ask what truths may lie hidden not only in Scotland, but across the ocean, in lands where Templars may have walked long before Columbus. For centuries, scattered clues have lain hidden across continent stones carved with mysterious runes, towers whose arches defy their supposed builders, maps that suggest knowledge of lands unknown, chapels encrusted with symbols, alignments, of stars and geometry traced into earth and forest. Taken separately, each is strange. Taken together, they form something more unsettling, a shadow history. A version of the past in which explorers crossed oceans long before Columbus, guided not only by wind and tide, but by secrecy, ritual, and devotion to causes history prefers. To forget, the story begins, for most, with the Kensington Runestone, discovered in 1898 in a farmer's field in Minnesota. Its runes describe a Norse expedition in the 14th century. Decades before Columbus ever dreamed of crossing the Atlantic. At first dismissed as a hoax, the stone became stranger the closer it was studied. Its runes included a curious detail: the hooked X, a symbol that appeared not only on this stone, but on other artifacts, manuscripts, and even grave markers associated with medieval Scandinavia, and, curiously, with the later rituals of secret societies. To some, the hooked X was nothing but a flourish in carving. To others, it was a cipher, a mark left by those carrying forward a hidden tradition. If the Runestone were alone, perhaps it would have faded as a curiosity. But it is not alone. Across the Massachusetts countryside, carved faintly into a granite ledge, lies the Westford Knight. For centuries, locals insisted the lines were natural scratches in stone. Yet as the sun struck at certain angles, a figure emerged, the outline of a knight in armor, a sword at his side, a cross upon his chest. To believers, it was a memorial, a carved tribute to a fallen knight who had died in the New World. His name, they claimed, was Sir James Gunn, companion of Henry Sinclair, who sailed west from Scotland in the 14th century. The carving is weathered, faint, nearly gone, but its persistence in local memory and the uncanny lines that still suggest the shape of a knight refuse to be erased. Then there is the Newport Tower, standing in Rhode Island. It looks like no ordinary colonial mill. Its stone arches resemble not New England practicality, but medieval architecture rounded, almost Romanesque, echoing Templar churches across the Atlantic. Its windows align curiously with the sun on solstices, suggesting astronomical intent. No records exist of its construction in the early colonial years, though local lore insists it predates European settlement. To some, it is a colonial curiosity. To others, it is proof a remnant of voyagers who left their mark long before England ever staked claim to the New World. Further still lies the Zeno Map, a document from the 16th century that depicts islands and coasts in the North Atlantic with startling accuracy. Some of its landforms match parts of Greenland, Iceland, even Nova Scotia at a time when such regions were supposedly unmapped. The map's origins trace back to Venetian navigators said to have sailed with Henry Sinclair on his westward voyage. Critics call it a forgery or a misinterpretation, but to those who connect the threads, it is a map not of imagination but of memory, preserving knowledge gained in secret expeditions. And then there is Rosslyn Chapel, whose carved maze and aloe defy the chronology of botany, whose crypt is sealed and whispered to hold relics of the Holy Land, whose geometry echoes sacred proportions, and whose lineage ties directly to the Sinclair family, the very family accused of carrying the Templar flame into Scotland and, from there, across the Atlantic. Rosslyn does not stand alone. It is a keystone, the place where architecture, symbolism, and legend converge, pointing both backward to the lost order of the Knights Templar and forward to the idea of America as a new world already known, already touched long before Columbus. But even these are not the only signs. Across Nova Scotia, patterns of land and stone appear when viewed from above, forming alignments to Venus and other celestial bodies. Forest clearings trace geometric shapes, triangles and crosses that serve no agricultural purpose. Local folklore whispers of Europeans arriving long before the French. On Oak Island, strange shafts, stones carved with symbols, and alignments to solstices and stars suggest not merely a treasure hunt gone wrong, but a deliberate, encoded design. To some, this is evidence of nothing more than overzealous imagination. To others, it is the lingering trace of a Templar presence, a group intent on carrying their secrets across the ocean, embedding them in geometry and land, as they had once embedded them in cathedrals and chapels. All of these fragments, the Runestone, the Hooked X, the Knight, the Tower, the Zeno Map, Rosslyn, Nova Scotia, Oak Island, when taken together, form a narrative that history has never officially endorsed, but which refuses to die. It is a narrative of survivors when the Templar Order was destroyed in 1307, when its Grand Master was burned at the stake in Paris and its knights were imprisoned or killed. Not all were captured. Some fled. Some ships vanished from La Rochelle, never accounted for. Legends say they carried not only wealth but knowledge, relics, perhaps even the Grail itself. Where did those ships go? Some say Portugal, some Scotland, some to the hidden islands of the North Atlantic, and from there, perhaps further still to a new world across the sea. This is not a story that mainstream historians like to tell to academia. These fragments are noise, misinterpretations, wishful thinking, or outright hoaxes. The Kensington Runestone is dismissed as a 19th century fabrication. The Westford Knight is chalked up to weathering. The Newport Tower is labeled a colonial mill. No more, no less. The Zeno Map is called an invention. Rosslyn's maze is dismissed as misidentified foliage. Oak Island is relegated to treasure hunter fantasy. Skepticism reigns. And perhaps rightly so. History must guard against falsehoods. And not every story carved in stone is truth. But the resistance is not only scholarly, it is also cultural. To accept these fragments as real would be to rewrite the story of America, of Europe, of discovery itself. It would be to admit that Columbus was not first, that Leif Erikson was not the last Norseman to sail west, that perhaps secret orders carried knowledge across the ocean centuries before history says they could have. It would be to admit that the boundaries of our understanding are not as solid as textbooks suggest, and such admissions are dangerous. They unsettle, they rewrite national myths, they challenge the certainty that history is a settled story rather than a contested mystery. Yet, for all the resistance, the allure remains. Researchers continue to study the Runestone, tracing the peculiar grammar of its runes to medieval forms unknown in the 19th century, suggesting authenticity. Others measure the Newport Tower, noting alignments too precise to dismiss as coincidence. At Roslin, botanists confirm that the carvings resemble American plants more than European analogues. On Oak Island, excavations uncover artifacts that hint at European presence long before official colonization. Each discovery adds fuel to the fire, keeping alive the possibility that we are glimpsing fragments of a hidden past. And perhaps this is the true heart of the mystery. It is not about proving definitively that Templars reached America. It is about the willingness to imagine that history is not complete, that our past may hold secrets deliberately obscured, erased, or overlooked. The Templars were more than soldiers. They were custodians of knowledge, explorers, builders, and mystics, if they did cross the ocean. Perhaps it was not for conquest, but for preservation, for carrying forward something too dangerous, too sacred, to leave vulnerable in Europe's wars and persecutions. The secrecy, the symbols, the alignments, the maps, these may not be accidents. They may be the breadcrumbs of a hidden migration, one meant not for the public record, but for those with eyes to see. Perhaps the Runestone was not written for farmers but for initiates. Perhaps the Westford Knight was not carved for the masses, but for a brotherhood. Who would recognize its lines? Perhaps Roslin was not built as a parish, but as a vault, a cipher in stone. Perhaps Oak Island's shafts were not dug for treasure, but as an archive, a place where knowledge could sleep beneath earth and tide until the world was ready to receive it. And yet, what do we do with such possibilities? Do we dismiss them, clinging to the safety of consensus, or do we entertain them, allowing ourselves to step into the uncomfortable space where history and myth blur? For many, it is easier to reject, to laugh off the hooked X's fantasy, to call the maze a mason's whim, to insist that towers are mills and knights are weathered scratches in stone. For others, the allure is too strong. They return again and again to the stones, the maps, the chapels, searching for a pattern that might finally reveal the truth. What is certain is this: the past is not as fixed as we think. The stones do not lie. They endure. They carry forward the marks of hands long dead, hands that carved runes, etched figures, raised arches, aligned windows with stars. Whether we interpret those marks as hoaxes, mistakes, or messages depends not on the stones, but on us. And perhaps that is the final mystery, that history is not merely what happened, but what we choose to see, what we are willing to imagine, what we allow ourselves to believe. Tonight, as we stand at the end of this long journey through runes, towers, maps, chapels, and legends, the question remains unanswered. Did the Knights Templar cross the ocean? Did they leave behind these scattered clues? Or are we chasing shadows, projecting our own desire for mystery onto the silence of stone? We may never know for certain, but the persistence of these mysteries tells us something just as profound: that humanity longs for stories larger than the ones we are given, stories that reach across oceans, that refuse to be confined by borders or by time. And so the Runestone waits in Minnesota. The Westford Knight sleeps beneath its veil of lichen. The Newport Tower stands, its arches catching the sun. The Zeno Map gathers dust. Roslin whispers to those who enter its nave. Oak Island keeps its secrets beneath the tide. They wait, not for proof, but for eyes willing to see, for minds willing to question, for hearts willing to wonder. Because, perhaps, just perhaps, history is not finished. Perhaps the story is still unfolding, one hidden stone at a time. By the late 1800s and into the 20th century, the landscape of America was changing rapidly. Railroads carved through mountains, cities stretched skyward, and industries reshaped the rhythm of daily life. In this modern age of progress, the faint whispers of carved runes, weathered knights, and strange towers might have seemed like relics of superstition, unworthy of serious attention. Yet, paradoxically, it was in this era of acceleration that interest in these old enigmas began to surge. Perhaps it was because the world was moving too quickly, and people sensed that something vital from the past was being left behind. Or perhaps it was because the more the modern world sought certainty, the more the cracks in official history began to trouble the curious minds who dared to look. The Kensington Runestone emerged in 1898, and its discovery instantly polarized the small Minnesota community. Local farmers marveled at it, taking pride in the thought that their soil might hold a connection to explorers who reached America before Columbus. Scholars, however, scoffed. They dismissed the farmer, Olaf Oman, as either gullible or deceitful. For decades, the stone was labeled a forgery. Its runes were said to be inconsistent, its story implausible, yet the stone remained immovable, etched with words that no one could erase. Some researchers returned to it again and again, insisting that its language was not only authentic, but held peculiar features that aligned with a hidden tradition, those curious hooked X markings, which would later ignite even deeper theories. Meanwhile, in Massachusetts, the faint carving known as the Westford Knight began to gather renewed attention. Locals had passed down the story of a knight etched into stone for generations. But by the 19th century, antiquarians and amateur historians began to visit, sketching the lines, debating their meaning. To skeptics, it was natural striation, the result of erosion and imagination. But to believers, it was far too precise, a sword, a shield, a cross, the story that it marked the grave of Sir James Gunn, companion of Henry Sinclair, gained strength. Books began to mention it, lectures discussed it, and slowly, the carving moved from local legend to contested artifact. The faint lines became a battlefield, not of steel, but of interpretation. Was it simply scratches, or was it one of the earliest European memorials on American soil? The Newport Tower, too, refused to remain silent. Rising above Rhode Island's colonial homes, it stood as an enigma with no clear origin. Early antiquarians debated whether it was built by Vikings, Portuguese navigators, or English settlers. Its round arches and sturdy columns resembled architecture not of colonial New England, but of medieval Europe. Some dismissed it as a windmill, a utilitarian structure with no mystery at all. Yet its alignment with solstices, the strangeness of its proportions, and its lack of colonial records troubled the easy explanation. By the late 19th century, the tower had already become a lightning rod for speculation, inspiring artists, writers, and even politicians who wondered if it represented proof of pre-Columbian voyages. These three mysteries, the Runestone, the Knight, and the tower, began to form a constellation of curiosity. They were not isolated. Rather, they resonated with one another, each echoing the possibility that the history of America was older, stranger, and more connected to Europe than the official narrative admitted. And when the pieces were compared, patterns began to emerge. Runes in Minnesota spoke of Scandinavian explorers. A knight in Massachusetts suggested Scottish nobles crossing the sea. A tower in Rhode Island hinted at medieval builders far from home. Taken separately, each could be explained away, taken. Together, they formed a puzzle too coherent to ignore. It was in this period that researchers like Edward Rowe Snow, an aviation pioneer and historian, began to write about these mysteries in earnest. Snow and others treated them not as idle curiosities, but as potential evidence of hidden chapters in history. The more attention these artifacts received, the more the public imagination was stirred. And with imagination came conflict. Academics, grounded in traditional history, doubled down on skepticism. They branded alternative theories as pseudoscience, eager to protect the boundaries of accepted knowledge. But for every dismissal, there were readers, listeners, and seekers who asked, if the evidence is so easily explained away, then why does it continue to trouble us? Why does it refuse to vanish? In the early 20th century, secret societies and fraternal orders also began to circle these enigmas. The Freemasons, heirs to symbols and rituals linked at least in legend to the Templars, took an interest in sites like Rosslyn Chapel and the Newport Tower. For them, these were not merely ruins, but markers of continuity, evidence that their traditions stretched back through time in ways that mainstream history refused to acknowledge. Some Masonic writings even suggested that the Westford Knight and the Runestone were physical proofs of a transatlantic voyage carrying not just men, but sacred knowledge to outsiders. This was fanciful. To initiates, it was affirmation. The mid-20th century brought new waves of exploration. Oak Island in Nova Scotia, long a site of treasure-hunting lore, became a focal point. Traps, tunnels, and strange artifacts found in its soil deepened the suspicion that something had been hidden. Deliberately, though the island swallowed fortunes and lives in search of gold, its true treasure might have been symbolic, a continuation of the same mysterious trail that stretched from Minnesota to Massachusetts. The possibility that the Templars, fleeing persecution in Europe, had buried something on Oak Island gave the legend an air of both danger and destiny. And then came the scholars who dared to blur the lines between academic study and forbidden speculation. In the latter half of the 20th century, writers such as Frederick Pohl and later Scott Wolter began to re-examine the Runestone and other artifacts, arguing that they were not only authentic, but linked by the hooked X symbol to a lineage of hidden knowledge. Their work was ridiculed by academia, yet it reached wide audiences, planting seeds of doubt in the official narrative. Once again, the stones refused to be silenced. By this time, the pattern was clear. Every generation, the same mysteries would resurface, examined, dismissed, and yet never forgotten. The cycle revealed something profound, that history is not just about evidence, but about belief. To the skeptic, the Runestone is a forgery, the Knight an illusion, the tower a colonial windmill. To the believer, they are fragments of a suppressed story, and to those caught between, they are tantalizing puzzles too strange to explain away, too uncertain to embrace fully. What made these debates so charged was not only the question of fact, but the question of implication. If the Templars or Scandinavian explorers tied to them had reached America, it would mean that knowledge of the New World existed long before Columbus. It would mean that voyages were made in secrecy, outside the authority of kings and popes. It would mean that the very foundation of the discovery of American narrative was unstable. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it would mean that symbols, rituals, and traditions thought to belong to secret orders in Europe had already crossed the ocean centuries before the colonies were born. The skeptics were not only protecting academic rigor, they were protecting a worldview. If history is rewritten, then identity shifts. Nations built on the myth of discovery would have to face the truth of earlier rivals, religions. Built on authority would have to reckon with the possibility of suppressed knowledge. Power, in short, would have to share its stage. And so the stones were dismissed, not only for their supposed flaws, but because their acceptance would be too disruptive. Yet outside the walls of academia, the mysteries continued to thrive. Documentaries, lectures, and books kept the story alive. The public, often more open to wonder than institutions, embraced the idea of lost voyages, hidden knights, and encoded maps. Popular culture played its part, weaving tales of Templar treasures and secret histories into novels and films. Each retelling may have been speculative, even fictional, but it ensured that the Westford Knight, the Kensington Runestone, and their kin would not fade into obscurity. In quiet moments, though, one wonders about the seekers themselves, the farmers, the antiquarians, the historians ridiculed by their peers. Why did they persist? Why did they dedicate their lives to puzzles that brought more scorn than reward? Perhaps because they sensed that even if the stones did not prove voyages, they proved something deeper, that history is alive, and that the past cannot be fully contained by books. Perhaps because they felt, in their bones, that the world is larger, stranger, and richer than our neat categories allow. The true story of the 19th and 20th centuries is not just the industrial age, the wars, the revolutions. It is also the persistence of wonder, the refusal of certain stones to stay silent, the courage of seekers to face ridicule in the name of possibility. The Runestone, the Knight, the Tower, Roslin, Oak Island, these are not only artifacts. They are characters in a long drama, one that pits certainty against curiosity, power against imagination, silence against memory. And the play is not over. Even today, the debates continue. Modern technology can skin stones, date carvings, and analyze pigments. Yet the results often raise as many questions as they answer. Weathering patterns on the Westford Knight remain ambiguous. Linguistic studies of the Runestone still fuel heated arguments. The Newport Tower resists easy categorization. Oak Island continues to yield tantalizing but inconclusive finds. Roslin's carvings still defy botanical logic. And through it all, the hooked X symbol resurfaces in unexpected places, tying the fragments together like a hidden thread. Perhaps the real legacy of the 19th and 20th centuries is not resolution, but transmission. These generations carried the mysteries forward, keeping them alive for us. They ensured that we could stand today at the same threshold, staring at the same stones, asking the same questions. Their debates may seem repetitive, but they are vital, for without them, the artifacts might have been lost, destroyed, or forgotten. Instead, they endure, suspended in ambiguity, challenging us to wonder. And so, as the modern world surges forward, we find ourselves haunted by old stones, not because they are obstacles, but because they are invitations to slow down, to question, to dream. They remind us that history is not a closed book, but an open sea, full of currents we do not yet understand. And perhaps, somewhere in that sea, the ships of the Templars still sail, carrying with them secrets not meant to be buried, but meant to be discovered in their own time. On the windswept coast of Nova Scotia, where the Atlantic endlessly claws at rocky shores and fog drifts like ghosts across the water, there's a place that has haunted seekers for more than 2 centuries. Oak Island, a small crescent of land, ringed by salt water and shadow, does not look extraordinary at first glance. Fishermen once used it for timber and small plots of cultivation, and its shores seemed no different from any of the thousands of islands scattered across Canada's eastern seaboard. But beneath its surface, according to generations of treasure hunters, lies a mystery so vast that it has swallowed fortunes, lives, and dreams, leaving behind little more than whispers of something buried, something hidden, something deliberately concealed by hands that understood secrecy better than survival. The story begins in 1795. when a teenager named Daniel McGinnis stumbled across a depression in the soil. It looked unnatural, like the ground had once been disturbed. Curiosity drew him back with friends, and they began digging. What they found was no simple hollow, but a shaft that seemed to plunge endlessly downward. Built with care and craft, every few feet, wooden platforms appeared, as though the earth itself had been carefully layered to slow or deter intruders. The deeper they dug, the stranger it became. Water seeped in, as though the sea itself conspired to flood the shaft. It became clear someone had gone to great lengths not to dig a hole, but to build a trap. Word spread quickly, and with it the lure of riches. Could this be a pirate horde? Some whispered the name of Captain Kidd, the infamous privateer said to have buried treasure along the Atlantic seaboard. Others insisted it was Spanish or French gold, hidden away during wars. But as the generations passed and expeditions multiplied, another theory grew stronger. This was no mere treasure. This was something older, stranger, perhaps sacred. The Templars, fleeing persecution in the 14th century, were said to have carried vast wealth, relics, and knowledge. Their fleet vanished from France after the arrests of 1307, their fate unknown. Could it be that some of their ships crossed the ocean, seeking refuge in the wild lands of Nova Scotia, and buried their most precious cargo in a labyrinth of earth and stone? The money pit, as it came to be known, swallowed wealth faster than it yielded it. Time and again, diggers reached astonishing depths: 90 feet, 100 feet, more, and then disaster struck. Flood tunnels, ingeniously constructed, channeled seawater into the shaft, drowning efforts, erasing progress. Each wooden platform unearthed seemed a mocking reminder that whoever built this trap had thought ahead, preparing for intruders centuries. In the future, coconuts' fibers were discovered in the soil, imported from distant lands, suggesting deliberate design rather than chance. Carved stones with cryptic symbols were reported at depth, fueling speculation that the entire pit was more than a vault. It was a coded message, a warning, or perhaps an initiation. By the 19th century, Oak Island had become an obsession. Wealthy backers poured fortunes into excavation. Engineers devised schemes to pump water, build cofferdams, even divert the ocean itself. Each attempt ended in ruin. Money evaporated, lives were lost, and the island seemed cursed. The legend of the Oak Island curse was born the belief that 7 men must die before the treasure is found. To date, 6 have perished, their lives claimed by collapses, drowning, or accidents. Each death only deepened the conviction that the island was protected, not just by cunning engineering, but by destiny itself. But what was buried there? Gold, religious relics, sacred texts. Here the Templar theory gained traction. The Order, once the most powerful military and financial institution in Europe, had amassed not only wealth but secrets. They were rumored to have uncovered the Ark of the Covenant during their time in Jerusalem, or manuscripts from Solomon's temple. They were guardians of knowledge, custodians of mysteries. When the French king moved against them, some believed their fleet sailed away into obscurity, carrying these relics to safety. Oak Island, remote yet defensible, may have been their chosen vault. The money pit, then, would not simply guard gold but preserve the heart of their legacy. For believers, clues abound. The stone cross discovered on nearby Nolan's Cross, a series of massive boulders arranged with uncanny precision, points to a deliberate design. Some researchers have mapped its geometry, claiming it mirrors sacred patterns, even star alignments associated with Templar tradition. Others point to parallels between the Newport Tower's architecture and Oak Island's subterranean engineering, suggesting a shared origin or purpose. The hooked X symbol, carved into the Kensington Runestone and identified by researchers as a Templar marker, has also been whispered in connection with Oak Island artifacts. Though its presence is contested, skeptics argue that treasure hunters, desperate for meaning, saw patterns where none existed. They suggest the pit may have been a natural sinkhole, the coconut fibers ballast dumped by sailors, the boulders random. But even skeptics stumble when faced with the sheer engineering of the flood tunnels, which seem too deliberate to be coincidence. And so the island straddles that twilight realm where skepticism cannot close the case, and belief cannot open it. The 20th century did little to resolve the mystery. Franklin Roosevelt himself, long before he became president, joined an Oak Island expedition, convinced that treasure or truth awaited below. Later, Robert Dunfield, Dan Blankenship, and others devoted their lives to it, pouring machines, manpower, and millions into the island's soil. They uncovered artifacts, old coins, scraps of parchment, bits of chain, even worked at impossible depths. Each discovery hinted at deliberate human action. Yet still, the great secret remained out of reach, always buried just beyond the last collapse, the final flood. And then, as television expanded its reach, Oak Island became more than a local legend. Documentaries showcased the enigma. Theories multiplied. Not only Templars, but Shakespearean manuscripts, Inca treasure, even alien relics. The island transformed from a site into a symbol, the embodiment of the human hunger for hidden knowledge, the willingness to chase mystery at any cost. But in quieter moments, away from the noise of speculation, the Templar thread remains the most haunting. It ties Oak Island not only to Nova Scotia, but to the wider chain of enigmas: the Westford Knight in Massachusetts, the Newport Tower in Rhode Island, the Runestone in Minnesota, the carvings of Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. These are not isolated. They are scattered notes of a symphony, a pattern stretching across oceans and centuries. If Oak Island holds something sacred, then perhaps it is not treasure, but continuity, the hidden artery of a tradition that refused to die. When kings and popes declared it extinct, standing on the shores of Oak Island, with the Atlantic crashing in and the fog swallowing the horizon, it is not difficult to imagine a Templar ship anchoring here, tired men hauling chests ashore, their surcoats damp with salt spray, their eyes fixed with grim purpose. They would have known they might never return to Europe, never see their homeland again. Yet they dug, they engineered, they built traps not for pirates, but for posterity. What they buried was meant not for their children or their children's children, but for a future. They could not see a future where seekers would test themselves against stone and see, and perhaps prove worthy of the legacy. The thought is as sobering as it is stirring. If Oak Island is a vault, then its contents may never be retrieved, for perhaps they were not meant to be. Perhaps the island was not built to yield, but to guard forever. And in that sense, every failed expedition, every collapse, every death is not failure but success. Proof that the guardians did their work well. Yet hope lingers, as it always has, even now, with modern technology probing deeper than ever before. With sonar and drilling and scanning, the mystery refuses to die. New artifacts appear, fragments of parchment, shards of bone, pieces of metal. Each find reignites the fire, reminding seekers that something lies below. What, precisely, may never be known, but perhaps it is not the finding that matters. Perhaps Oak Island exists to remind us that some mysteries are not meant to be solved easily, that faith and persistence are as much a treasure as gold. The money pit, the cross of stones, the fragments and whispers, these are part of a larger story. A story of seekers chasing shadows across continents. The Westford Knight, the Newport Tower, the Runestone, Rosslyn, Oak Island, they are chapters in the same unfinished book. Each carries the weight of silence, the burden of ambiguity, and the spark of possibility. And together, they remind us that history is not a fixed tale but a labyrinth, where every dead end may be a door and every buried chamber a mirror. As the sun sets over Oak Island, its light fading into the Atlantic, one cannot help but feel the pull of that labyrinth. To stand there is to stand in the presence of something both haunting and holy. The island does not give up its secrets, but it does not let you forget them either. And perhaps that is its true power, not to reveal, but to remind, to keep alive. The hunger for knowledge that refuses to be buried, even when the earth itself conspires to hide it. And so the story of Oak Island rolls forward, not in solutions, but in seekers. Not in gold, but in questions. And among those questions, one rises. Above all, if the Templars did indeed leave something here, what were they trying to protect and from whom? At first glance, Rosslyn Chapel is simply a church, modest in scale, perched on a hill just outside Edinburgh. It could be mistaken for one of the many stone sanctuaries scattered across the Scottish countryside. But to stand inside its walls is to step into a labyrinth carved not in tunnels of earth, but in stone itself, where every arch, column, and capital whispers secrets. Light spills through stained glass in fractured hues, and shadows gather in corners, pooling like hidden ink across the carvings that cover every surface. Rosslyn is not a chapel that invites prayer as much as it demands attention, as though it were less a place of worship than a riddle waiting to be solved. It was built in the 15th century under the patronage of Sir William Sinclair, a member of the powerful Sinclair family, whose roots stretch back to Normandy and further still, into the tangled alliances of medieval Europe. To ordinary history, the chapel is a late Gothic masterpiece, filled with ornate stonework, angels, demons, and vines. But to those who seek patterns hidden beneath the surface, Rosslyn is something else entirely, a coded manuscript in stone, linking Scotland to the legacy of the Knights Templar, and by extension, to the great chain of enigmas that stretches across the Atlantic to Oak Island and beyond. What strikes visitors immediately is the density of carving. No surface is left plain. Green men peer from arches, symbols of fertility and rebirth that trace their origins to pagan traditions older than Christianity. Musical angels hold instruments, arranged in ways that some claim conceal a lost medieval tune. Recently decoded into haunting choral notes, dragons coil around pillars, their bodies knotted in endless loops. And yet among these medieval flourishes are anomalies, details that should not exist. Carvings of plants that Europe was not supposed to know in the 15th century. On one capital, clear as day, is a carving of maize corn. Another shows aloe, a plant associated with the Americas. Some claim to see cactus forms. And here lies the puzzle. These carvings predate Columbus's voyage by decades. If genuine, they suggest that someone in Scotland had knowledge of plants from a continent that, in the official timeline, had not yet been discovered by Europeans. Critics dismiss this, arguing the carvings are misidentified, stylized vines mistaken for maize, or aloe confused with lilies. But to those who follow the Templar trail, Rosslyn's corn and aloe are not errors, they are proof. They are whispers, carved in stone, that knowledge of the New World was already known, safeguarded by networks of families and orders who carried it in silence. The Sinclair family themselves are central to this theory. Their ties to the Templars run deep. After the order was dissolved in 1307, when the French king and the Pope conspired to destroy it, many Templars sought refuge in lands beyond papal control. Scotland, embroiled in wars of independence, was one such haven. Robert the Bruce, excommunicated at the time, welcomed warriors and builders. Some claim the Templars fought alongside him at Bannockburn in 1314, their cavalry turning the tide. The Sinclairs, powerful and sympathetic, may have sheltered them. Rosslyn Chapel, then, would not merely be a church but a monument built to encode their secrets, preserve their symbols, and project their knowledge into a future where the order itself had disappeared. The architecture itself hints at this dual purpose. Some columns are carved with the apprentice pillar, a twisted marvel wrapped in spiraling vines, linked to legends of initiation and sacrifice. Beneath the chapel, sealed crypts are rumored to contain treasures or relics. Sinclair coffins rest there, their shapes elongated, said by some to echo the sarcophagi of Jerusalem. But perhaps more intriguing than the crypts is the suggestion that Rosslyn's very floor plan encodes sacred geometry. Researchers have traced lines that align with star patterns, with Venus cycles, with mathematical ratios that recur in Templar iconography. To some, Rosslyn is less a church than a star map, a stone temple of coded astronomy, guiding seekers not just to heaven, but across oceans. Here the link to Oak Island sharpens. Several authors have argued that the Sinclairs, through their Templar connections, orchestrated voyages westward centuries before Columbus. The Zeno Map, an enigmatic chart published in the 16th century, but claiming roots in the 14th, shows knowledge of Atlantic islands, Greenland, and coastlines far in advance of mainstream exploration. The Sinclairs appear in these accounts tied to a mysterious Prince Henry Sinclair who, according to some narratives, sailed to Nova Scotia round 1398. If true, Rosslyn's carvings of corn and aloe are not anomalies but memorials, carved tributes to lands across the sea. And if Prince Henry's expedition reached Nova Scotia, could Oak Island be one of its legacies, a vault to preserve relics carried across the ocean? Walking through Rosslyn today, it is impossible to know where certainty ends and speculation begins. The stone is cool, the air heavy with the scent of centuries. Visitors wander with guidebooks, staring up at angels and devils, unaware they are standing inside a riddle that spans oceans. To the historian, Rosslyn is a Gothic masterpiece. To the seeker, it is a codebook, a stone cipher tying together threads of the Templar diaspora, the preservation of sacred relics, and the tantalizing hints of transatlantic voyages long before Columbus. The carvings themselves seem to invite contradiction. One visitor sees corn, another sees stylized wheat, one sees aloe, another sees a lily, but ambiguity is the point. Rosslyn does not declare, it suggests, teases, leaves room for doubt. Its builders did not want to shout secrets into history's ear. They wanted to whisper them, just loudly enough for those who knew what to look for. Some have even argued that Rosslyn was not meant to be solved at all. Its riddles, like those of Oak Island, are traps as much as treasures. To chase them is to be drawn deeper into labyrinths of meaning, where the line between symbol and fact dissolves. In this view, Rosslyn is less a vault of knowledge than a mirror, reflecting the obsessions of those who seek it. What you see in its carvings may reveal less about the Sinclairs than about yourself. Do you see corn? Then you believe in lost voyages. Do you see lilies? Then you cling to orthodoxy. Either way, the chapel has achieved its purpose. It has forced you to choose. Yet the connections do not end there. Masonic traditions, which emerged centuries later, have drawn heavily on Rosslyn's symbolism. Rituals echo its geometry. Legends claim its crypts hold the true origins of the craft. Freemasonry, in turn, has been accused of inheriting the Templar mantle, carrying their symbols into modern times. In this way, Rosslyn serves as a bridge not only between old world and new, but between medieval Templars and modern secret societies. To stand in its nave is to stand at a crossroads of centuries, where one order's destruction became another's genesis. When we weave this back into Oak Island, the picture grows sharper. If the Sinclairs sheltered Templars, if Prince Henry sailed west if Rosslyn encodes knowledge of the New World. Then Oak Island may not be an isolated puzzle but the final chapter of a deliberate chain. The carvings of maize in Scotland find their echo in the coconut fibers of Nova Scotia. The crypts of Rosslyn find their counterpart in the Money Pit's depths. The star patterns traced in stone become mirrored in Nolan's cross of boulders, and together they form a transatlantic network of secrecy, as though the Templars scattered their legacy like breadcrumbs, daring future generations to follow. But why? Why scatter clues rather than preserve them plainly? Perhaps because the Templars knew that secrecy is the only true safeguard. To lock knowledge in a vault is to invite theft. To encode it in stone, in symbols, in alignments only visible to the initiate, is to hide it in plain sight. Rosslyn, then, is not a treasure chest but a cipher key. Its carvings do not hold the treasure, but they may tell us where to look. There is a haunting symmetry here. Oak Island, with its endless pits and traps, is a labyrinth of earth. Rosslyn is a labyrinth of stone. Both refuse to yield fully, both consume seekers. Both blur the line between fact and faith, and perhaps both are meant to. The Templars were not merely guardians of wealth, they were guardians of mystery. They understood that mystery itself is power. The unanswered question compels. The unsolved riddle binds. To preserve knowledge forever is not to reveal it, but to ensure it is always being sought. As the years pass and Rosslyn continues to draw pilgrims of curiosity, its stones seem to grow heavier with meaning. Scholars write papers dismissing its anomalies, seekers, WRITE books proclaiming its secrets. Tourists leave dazzled but puzzled. The chapel itself remains silent, indifferent to interpretation, enduring as it has for centuries. Its corn, its aloe, its vines, they are still there, unchanged, waiting for eyes to decide what they see. Perhaps that is Rosslyn's greatest secret, not that it holds knowledge of the New World, or that it encodes Templar astronomy, but that it reveals how deeply we hunger for lost history. We cannot bear gaps in the record. We cannot accept that the greatest stories might lie unwritten. And so we turn stone into script, carving into code, coincidence into proof. Rosslyn does not answer the question, it asks it. What if the Templars sailed west? What if Oak Island holds their treasure? What if the history we know is but a fragment of a larger, hidden tale? And in asking those questions, Rosslyn keeps the mystery alive, not just in Scotland, not just in Nova Scotia, but in every seeker who walks into its shadowed nave. It is less a chapel than a reminder that some stories are too large, too strange, too dangerous to be written plainly. They must be carved in riddles, hidden in labyrinths, buried in islands. They must be chased, not given. And in that chase, across centuries and seas, the Templar trail continues, never fully solved, never entirely lost. Under the vaulted shadows of history, there's one force more powerful than stone walls, crypts, or even treasure buried beneath oceans of earth, the guardianship of official narrative. For every discovery, there's resistance. For every theory, a rebuttal. And nowhere is this more visible than in the uneasy relationship between the academic establishment and the mysteries of the Templars in America. If the carvings of Rosslyn Chapel suggest a voyage across the Atlantic before Columbus, if the Westford Knight whispers of a fallen Scottish warrior carved into Massachusetts stone, if the Kensington Runestone proclaims a Norse presence deep in the heart of Minnesota, then history itself begins to fray at the edges. It asks us to believe that the most basic timelines of discovery, the ones written into every school book, might be incomplete. And that is a dangerous suggestion, not because it is impossible, but because it destabilizes what so many have accepted as certain. In the halls of universities, certainty is currency. Peer-reviewed journals thrive on evidence that can be footnoted, dated, verified. Archaeologists dig for shards that can be carbon dated, for ruins that can be cross-referenced, with texts, theories that stretch beyond the official archive, that rely on carvings open to interpretation, or symbols that may or may not mean what they appear to, are treated with suspicion. Too many academics, the Templar trail across America belongs, not in lecture halls but in the margins of fringe history. And yet, the resistance is not merely about evidence, it is about survival. Imagine a young researcher, filled with curiosity, drawn to the mysteries of Oak Island or Roslyn. Perhaps they stumble upon an unusual document in an archive, or a pattern in geography that seems too precise to be accidental. They feel a spark, the same spark that has carried seekers across centuries, but to pursue it openly is to risk their career. In the world of academia, reputation is everything. A scholar who publishes on the Hooked X or on supposed Templar voyages risks being branded as unserious, their work dismissed before it is read. Funding dries up, invitations to conferences vanish, a life's work can be overshadowed by a single association with pseudo-history. The danger is not that the mystery lacks answers, the danger is that it dares to question the answers already agreed upon. There are parallels here with the Templars themselves, once a mighty order, trusted by kings. They fell not because they were guilty, but because they threatened the power of those above them. The Church could not tolerate an army of warrior monks loyal to no throne but their own. Inquisition and suppression followed, and the Templars' memory was rewritten by those who conquered them. In a way, modern academia plays a similar role. It does not burn heretics at the stake, but it silences them through ridicule, through omission, through the slow suffocation of careers. The guardians of orthodoxy are no longer popes and kings, but journals and faculties. And yet, the impulse is the same: protect the story that has already been written. But what happens when stones speak louder than silence? What happens when a farmer unearths a slab covered in runes in Minnesota, and no amount of dismissal erases its existence? What happens when a tower in Newport, Rhode Island, rises with arches and alignments that mirror old world churches? Even if no document places it there, these things remain, stubbornly. Like ghosts, the academic mind may wave them aside, but they refuse to vanish. And so we live in a tension, the weight of the unexplained pressing against the weight of the accepted. To the seeker, this tension is intoxicating. It is what draws thousands of viewers to documentaries, readers to speculative books, visitors to Oak Island or Roslyn Chapel. The mystery thrives not because it is solved, but because it resists solution, and the resistance itself becomes part of the story. Every time a university professor calls the Kensington Runestone a hoax, or the Westford Knight a natural formation, it does not end the debate, it fuels it. To the believer, dismissal feels like suppression, and suppression feels like proof. This is the paradox at the heart of forbidden history. The very act of denial becomes evidence. The Templars, after all, were erased from the record, and yet their legend grew tenfold in absence. Today, every unexplained stone, every anomaly in cartography, every whisper of sacred geometry is read through that lens. Perhaps the resistance means there is something to hide. Perhaps the very hostility of academia is itself a clue that the truth is too dangerous, too destabilizing to admit. Yet not all resistance is blind dismissal. Within the academic world, there are quiet voices who admit curiosity, who say off the record that some anomalies are indeed puzzling. They cannot publish on it, not without risking careers, but they acknowledge that gaps exist. Some have even tested artifacts, re-examined evidence, and found contradictions that raise more questions than they answer. It is a quiet rebellion, whispered in hallways, never placed in print. These whispers mirror the secretive survival of The Templars themselves, not destroyed, merely driven underground, waiting for a future when their legacy could resurface. And perhaps that is the essence of this entire story. The mysteries of the Templars in America exist in the shadows because shadows are where they must live. They thrive not in the clear light of proof, but in the twilight of possibility. To bring them into certainty would be to kill them, but to keep them hidden ensures their survival. Endlessly compelling, forever debated. Roslyn, Oak Island, Westford. Kensington, they are not answers. They are questions carved into the landscape. Questions that refuse to fade. For the seeker who sits awake at night, staring into the patterns of these mysteries, there's a sense of kinship with generations past. You are not the first to wonder if Prince Henry Sinclair sailed to Nova Scotia, nor the first to feel the thrill of connecting a rune to a hooked axe. You walk in the footsteps of countless others who have looked at the same carvings, the same maps, and whispered, "What if?" And in this way, the mystery is a chain, unbroken, each seeker linked to the last, each resistance strengthening the hunger for answers. In the end, perhaps the greatest treasure is not a chest of gold buried on Oak Island, nor a crypt beneath Roslyn filled with relics, but the pursuit itself, the Templars. If they were guardians of anything, were guardians of knowledge. Not open knowledge, not knowledge written in clear letters, but hidden knowledge, wrapped in symbols, carried across oceans, scattered in stone and legend. Knowledge that requires struggle, that demands faith, that forces those who seek it to risk ridicule, exile, even destruction. In this, the academics who resist and the seekers who chase are to halves of the same story. One guards the boundaries, the other presses against them. The truth, if it exists, lies in the pressure where they meet. So when you hear a professor dismiss the Kensington Runestone as a farmer's hoax, or the Newport Tower as a colonial mill, ask yourself, is this the end of the story, or the beginning? When you stand in Roslyn Chapel and trace the corn carved in stone, ask, is this proof of a voyage, or proof of our hunger to believe? When you watch treasure hunters on Oak Island lower another drill, ask, do they chase gold, or do they chase mystery itself? These are the questions that keep history alive. Questions that no suppression can silence. Questions that echo like chants through the ruins of time. The Templars, long ago, learned that the greatest power lies not in wealth but in secrecy. Today, the same principle holds true. For as long as these mysteries remain unsolved, they hold us. We return to them again and again, generation after generation, unable to look away. And perhaps that is the truest survival of all. Across centuries of rumor and stone, across oceans of speculation and faith, the mystery that has followed us from Roslyn to Nova Scotia, from carved runes in Minnesota to weathered figures in Massachusetts, gathers at last in one place, a small island off the coast of Nova Scotia, where men have dug endlessly into earth and water for more than 200 years, Oak Island. Here it feels as though every whisper of hidden knowledge, every clue tied to the Templars, every map, carving, and legend has converged into one final riddle. And it is here, too, that the human spirit of curiosity has perhaps been tested to its breaking point. The story of Oak Island begins in the late 1700s, when a group of boys stumbled across a depression in the ground beneath an old oak tree. They noticed strange marks on the bark and a block beneath the surface. To most, it might have been nothing, but curiosity compelled them to dig. And so they began to unearth what would become the most persistent mystery of the Americas, a shaft that seemed to descend endlessly into the earth, punctuated by layers of wood platforms at regular intervals, as if placed deliberately. The boys did not know it, but their small excavation was the first step into a labyrinth of tunnels, floods, collapses, and whispered treasures. As the decades passed, others came, driven by rumors of buried gold or ancient secrets. expeditions poured in wealthy investors, treasure hunters, dreamers, even former U.S. presidents like Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Each generation thought it would be the one to reach the bottom. Each generation added more tragedy and more intrigue. Lives were lost, fortunes were wasted, yet still the island called them back, as if the mystery itself was alive, always one step ahead, luring them deeper. Why does Oak Island matter in this story of the Templars? Because unlike the scattered carvings and scattered runestones, here we have a site that seems designed to conceal the shafts, the flooding tunnels, the carefully placed layers of timber. These are not accidents of geology. They suggest intention, engineering, intelligence. And once you admit that something was hidden here, the question becomes who hid it, and what could be so important that it was buried beneath layers of earth, protected by elaborate traps, and whispered about for generations? Some believe it was pirate treasure, perhaps belonging to Captain Kidd or Blackbird, buried and never retrieved. Others argue for Spanish gold, seized from the New World and concealed. But the more tantalizing theory, the one that connects Oak Island to everything else we have explored, is that it was the Knights Templar themselves. After their suppression in the early 1300s, legend tells us that the Templars vanished with their wealth and relics, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, documents from Solomon's temple. These were whispered to be among their treasures. Where could such relics be hidden? They could not remain in Europe. Under the eyes of kings and popes, they would need to be carried far away, to a place unknown to the world, beyond the reach of persecution. And if voyages across the Atlantic were possible, as the Zeno Map, the carvings of Rosslyn, and the trails of the Sinclair family suggest, then Nova Scotia would have been the perfect sanctuary. Here, the clues begin to converge. Oak Island is not far from other supposed Templar sites. The star alignments of Nova Scotia, the so-called sacred geometry mapped onto its bays and inlets, even rumors of buried markers stretching in lines across the coast. If Rosslyn Chapel encoded corn and aloe, plants unknown in Europe, then perhaps its builders knew of these voyages. If the Westford Knight is indeed the grave of Sir James Gunn, then explorers from Scotland had already crossed. And if the Kensington Runestone was carved in Minnesota, then the same brotherhood may have left markers across the continent. Oak Island, then, is not an isolated mystery. It is the culmination of a trail. But Oak Island is also more than treasure. It is a mirror. When we peer into its shafts, we see ourselves, our longing for certainty, our obsession with hidden knowledge, our refusal to stop searching even when reason tells us to. For over the centuries, men have poured millions into its soil, lowering drills, building cofferdams, diverting streams, all to pursue something they cannot name. Some claim to have found fragments of parchment, bits of gold chain, carved stones, with inscriptions, clues so small they only deepen the hunger for more. But no one has ever reached the bottom. No one knows what truly lies there. And perhaps that is the point. For the Templars, secrecy was not just a habit, it was their lifeblood. Their rituals were hidden, their archives concealed, their loyalty bound to mysteries the Church feared. If Oak Island was their doing, then the greatest secret they ever kept may not have been what they buried, but how they ensured that no one could ever retrieve it. The pit itself may be the treasure, a labyrinth designed to hold our curiosity captive, to ensure that we would spend generations digging, dreaming, never reaching an end. In this way, the Templars would achieve something greater than hiding relics. They would shape the imagination of centuries to come. And yet, even if Oak Island yields nothing, even if the tunnels collapse and the treasure is never found, its power endures. It reminds us that history is not closed, not finished, that beneath the surface of every accepted narrative lies the possibility of something more. And that possibility is the true treasure, the belief that what we have been told may not be all there is. Think back to everything we have traveled through together. The Kensington Runestone, with its cryptic runes and hooked X hinting at Norse explorers or secret Templar codes. The Westford Knight, carved into stone. Perhaps the grave of a fallen voyager who never returned home. The Newport Tower, standing in Rhode Island, its arches aligned with stars, echoing the designs of Europe. Rosslyn Chapel, with carvings of American plants centuries before Columbus. The Zeno Map, suggesting transatlantic voyages that predate the official story. Each of these is a fragment, a piece of a puzzle that has never been assembled. Oak Island is where they all gather, not in resolution, but in continuation. And so we return to the question that has lingered through all of this. What kind of story is history? Is it a ledger of proven facts, measured, dated, verified? Or is it a living thing, shaped by memory, imagination, and the refusal to let mysteries die? Perhaps it is both. Perhaps the official story is one thread, neat and documented, while beneath it winds another, tangled and unfinished, full of shadows and whispers. And perhaps the Templars themselves, guardians of secrets, understood that this was the way truth must survive, not in clarity, but in enigma. For those who dig on Oak Island, for those who stand in Rosslyn's crypts or trace runes on the Kensington stone, the pursuit is endless. They will never stop, because the treasure is not in the finding, it is in the seeking. The secret the Templars left us is not a chest of gold or a relic from the Holy Land. It is the unending hunger for more, the refusal to accept that the story is finished. That hunger keeps us searching, keeps us questioning, keeps history alive. So when you hear the tale of Oak Island, when you see another expedition lower its drills or another team map its tunnels, know that you are watching something larger than treasure hunting. You are watching the survival of a myth, the endurance of mystery itself. You are watching the Templars' greatest legacy, not wealth, not power, but the capacity to make us wonder. And maybe, in the end, that is the truest treasure, not gold beneath the soil, but the questions that will never leave us. Questions carved in stone, whispered in legends, written in runes, hidden in towers. Questions that turn history from a finished book into a living story. And as long as we keep asking them, the Templars will never truly be gone. They will remain in every mystery that resists explanation, in every seeker who cannot let go, in every stone that still speaks across the silence of time.